大家早安！欢迎大家莅临第2届台湾CBME周国际医学教育研讨会。刚刚的影片呢，是我特别为了大家做的 AI 影片。那个 AI 主播人是我啦，哈，哎，她比较漂亮还是我比较漂亮？真的吗？谢谢大家。好，大家真的是日行一善啊。好，我们非常有创意的开场，希望让大家有个愉快的一天哈。好，那在这个 AI 的时代呢，我们面对我们医学教育，我们要共创实施科学。除了我们要跟教师、学员共创这样子一个美好的教学经验之外，我们也可以期望跟 AI 共创更宽广的 AI 新篇章。好，那我是中国医药大学附设医院教学部的行政主管刘纯怡，今天很荣幸跟我们伟君主任担任今天我们的串场主持人哈，来。
大家好，我是超音波训练中心主任林伟君，也欢迎各位来到中国医药大学。
欢迎，欢迎我们所有的贵宾。今天我们是非常的期待与大家共度这美好的一天。好，那首先我们先恭请中国医药大学医学院蔡崇豪院长致欢迎词。
蔡崇豪院长是中国医药大学附设医院神经部主任及教授，也是中国医药大学医学院的院长，也是台湾动作障碍学会理事长、国际帕金森学会亚太区执行理事。我们再次掌声欢迎蔡崇豪蔡院长。
Our distinguished international speaker, Professor Laura Edgar, and Professor Jensen Frank, and Professor Petro Tanaka, and also Raghdah Al-Bualy. Thank you for your coming and visit Taiwan. 那特别欢迎我们，谢谢那个医策会张尚存董事长，还有台湾医学教育协会理事长，也是台大医学院院长倪远贤理事长。另外还有我们的5个 CBME 周的主办机构的代表，北医大的胡朝荣副院长，还有陈建宇副教务长，另外国泰医院的简志成副院长，长庚基任医院龚家德副院长，肖正田副院长。还有张义哲主任，急诊医协会的许建清理事长，还有中国医药大学医学院副院长林家德副院长，还有中国医药大学教学部副院长邱德华副院长，还有今天我们劳苦功高的周致丞周主任。I would like to address the opening remark by English. And thank you very much for coming to China Medical University today. And as we know, the competence-based medical education, also known as the outcome-based education, is considered to be the most important medical education reform of the 21st century. Its primary goal is to enhance the quality of health care and public trust in medical profession. And CBME was first proposed in WHO in 1978, defining the cultivation of healthcare professionals who, in accordance with local conditions, achieve a predetermined level of professional competence to meet local needs. And as we know, CBME with a focus on addressing contemporary societal needs for improved healthcare, outline the competence learner must acquire to fulfill these needs and then design educational program centered around the learner. And it emphasizes a learner-centric approach, clarify the structure of learning, respects individual difference, allow for diverse personal growth rates, and view times as learning resources rather than a proxy for learning outcomes. And as we know, the term competence in medical education refers to habitual and judicious use of communication, knowledge, skill, clinical reasoning, emotion, value, and reflection in daily practice, providing beneficial services to individual patients and society. And in a broader context of education, competencies encompass the integration of understanding knowledge, implementing skill, and expressing attitude in various situations, addressing societal demands and challenges in life, and achieving the goal of the lifelong autonomous learning. The implementation of science focuses on how evidence and theory are translated into everyday application in complex social systems. Democratic values provide a crucial foundation for the effective operation of scientific implementation, promoting evidence-based decision-making, stakeholder participation, transparent processes, and high-quality medical education. Against this backdrop, the second Taiwan CBME week aims to combine the implementation of science and democracy to promote the practice of competence-based medical education. And the meeting is organized by China Medical University and Hospital, Taipei Medical University and Hospital, and Kasei General Hospital, Chang'an Memorial Hospital, and also Taiwan Society Emergency Medicine, and also in cooperation with international CBME community, the Taiwan Medical Education Society, and also strongly supported by Yichehui. We look forward for an exciting symposium today, and welcome everyone to China Medical University to collaborate on the future of competence-based medical education. And welcome everybody. Thank you.
谢谢蔡崇豪院长致辞。接下来我们恭请医策会张尚纯董事长为我们致辞。
张尚纯教授是国立台湾大学副校长，现任医策会董事长，台湾医学会常务理事及台湾内科学会理事长，以及行政院首席防疫顾问。那张尚纯董事长，我想大家不用多做介绍，是除非网红类唯一可以在台湾刷脸畅行无阻的这个董事长。好，我们热烈掌声欢迎张尚纯董事长。
Distinguished guests, Dean Tsai, Dean Ni, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. It's my great pleasure and honor to be invited to give an opening speech in this very important symposium today. First, I would like to our sincere and warm welcome to our distinguished guests coming from different parts of the world. Thank you very much for coming and will give a very important speech during this symposium to share your experience and opinion in this very important topic of CBME. And in contrast to Dean Tsai, I will say a few words in Mandarin to welcome our local participants. 首先，非常高兴哈，那有机会在疫情之后，就我所知，应该是第2次办这个台湾 Week of CBME 啊哈。 在疫情当中受到很多的干扰，所以很多活动就没有办法好好进行。不过，像刚才蔡院长所提到的，然后我想在座大家也都很清楚，我们的医学教育，随着时代的改变，那持续不断的在进步。那所谓的 Competency-based Medical Education， 这当然也不是一个很新的题目了。我们已经在过去已经在全世界或者包括在台湾，也很努力的推动这个对医学教育来说，应该是一个很好，也算是一个很理想的一个模式了哈。不过虽然我们台湾也已经努力推动了一段时间。可是我们也知道，其实它还是有很多不容易，或者甚至说困难的地方。理想是很好，让我们的每一个学生或受训的学员很清楚他们的 competence 到底在每一个阶段进展到什么程度。不过，因为大家也知道，我们台湾的特别是临床这一个部分，我们的临床老师都是临床医师嘛，这些临床医师，平常实在是非常非常的忙碌了哈。在这样的情况下，我们台湾还可以维持一个很好的临床医学教育，其实已经非常不容易了。以我们的人力，以我们的资源来说，国家给我们的资源，那其实是非常不容易做到这样的程度。我们要更往前进展，让所谓的 CBME 我们可以了解到每一个学生或是每一个学员，他们在每一个地方每一个阶段可以学到多少，能力进展到多少，做一个很好的一个评估，让他们一方面他们自己也很清楚，二方面我们所谓的老师们也很清楚每一个学生学员到底到什么程度，我们要怎么样让他们学得更好，在每一个阶段结束的时候都是变成一个符合我们期待的有 competent 的结束的学生或是毕业生，这确实一方面非常重要，一方面以台湾现在的医疗生态、医疗状况来说，确实是也是非常的不容易的哈。所以在这边当然要谢谢我们所有的从事医学教育的工作者，我们这些老师们，那也要谢谢我们很广大的第一线指导学生、指导学员的老师们，确实是非常的不容易。不过，虽然不容易啊，那我们台湾过去的努力，不管在毕业后的阶段专科住院医师的训练，或者是 PGY 训练，也都努力的推动这个CBME 嘛那也许在座也不少人知道，在过去疫情结束之后，我们也推动了 undergraduate 的毕业前的 CBME 那这也是结合我们的所有医学院校的医学系，大家一起来讨论。那在教育部的计划支持之下，我们已经过去做了1年的时间，那也有不错的一些进展了那不过每次讨论起来，大家都还知道说，毕业后的老师们就已经很辛苦了，然后又要再involve到毕业前的那就是更加倍的辛苦了所以对台湾来说真的是有它不容易的地方。不过我想今天这样的一个活动，当然确实是非常重要，也非常谢谢我们主办单位那规划了很好的一个内容，那也邀请到这么多重要的国外的专家贵宾来到现场，或者是 online， 那可以跟大家来一起讨论、一起分享。希望在这样的一个活动当中，我们不管是过去已经在从事 CBME 的我们的所有的在这个领域的台湾的 leader 还有我们的第一线的所有的从事的老师们那可以在这样的活动当中可以学到更多，可以更想一想，经由别人的经验，那怎么样拓展我们国内 特别的环境之下，我们怎么样去做，可以把我们的所谓的 CBME 让学员或是让我们的课程的规划，让我们的训练内容的规划，那或者是对于没有达到我们理想的这些学员或学生，我们有什么样的补强措施，可以让他们达到我们的理想的每一个阶段该学到的这些 competence 哈。好，那这是祝大家在今天的活动当中都可以有很好的收获。那 lastly, I would like to say I believe every participant will learn a lot during this important symposium, and hope our every distinguished guest you can enjoy your wonderful stay in Taiwan. Thank you.
好，非常感谢张尚成董事长的勉励。在此，我们先邀请5位辛苦的筹备委员起立，跟大家挥手致意一下。中国附医周致丞主任，北医陈建宇副教务长，急诊医学会代表肖正廷副院长，国泰简志成副院长，长庚张玉泽教授。谢谢你们辛苦的筹备，带领我们筹备团队来完成今天的任务。好，那接下来恭请台湾医学教育学会倪衍璇理事长以及中医大医学院蔡崇豪院长上台主持第一个演讲，主题是实施科学与我们从全球CBME中所学的经验。
倪衍璇教授是台大医学院小儿科特聘教授及台大医学院的院长，是台湾医学教育学会理事长。我们欢迎2位座长。
好，well, yeah. Good morning, everybody. It's really my great honor and pleasure to be here. And I think the first talk, I'm going to introduce Dr. Jason Frank. Dr. Jason Frank is a clinician educator with a focus on all aspects of health professions training system. He is right now he is a professor in the Department of Emergency Medicine at the University of Ottawa, Faculty of Medicine, as well as an attending physician in Ottawa Hospital. Dr. Jason Frank obtained his MD degree from the University of Ottawa, and later on he got his FRCPC in emergency medicine at the University of Toronto. He has published a lot of important papers, especially in the field of medical education. And I think his research interest mostly focus on competence-based medical education, which is the mainstream of this symposium. So we are looking forward to your wonderful talk and welcome you. Dr. Frank, the podium is yours, please.
Thank you. Good morning. And a very big thank you for all of the work that the organizing committee has done. It is an honor to be here. Thank you, Professor Ni. Thank you, Professor Tsai. Thank you, Professor Zhang. It's so great to be here once again. The last time I was in this room was, I think it was this room, was in 2018. So it is my pleasure to be here. Your Canadian friends admire your work. Can I have the slides, please? Okay. Also, I want to thank you for taking me out of Canadian winter. It's so nice here. Normally, my city in Ottawa, Canada, looks like this, which is we love winter. We're Canadians. We love winter. But this year, it is very warm. So normally, we skate on our canal at this time of year. We have a festival, 1 million visitors, and my residents in emergency medicine, they reduce fractures for the entire festival because people, they fall on the canals, first time they're skating. But with climate change, it hasn't frozen this year, so I'm still happy to be here amongst you. I have been given a challenging task today. It is my honor to kick off today's events and to set up the discussions later today and the other really distinguished speakers. My job is to remind us of the journey of CBME worldwide. It has been my life's work to help countries around the world implement this competency-based approach to health professions education. So allow me to take you on a little journey and talk about how it began, some of the steps that have been taken, some of the definitions, and then I'll give you some insights from other countries. And hopefully at the end of that, you'll have some ideas about what you and your work here in Taiwan you can do next. I'll tell you right away that when I speak to other countries, I mention you, because Taiwan has been working on CBME for a number of years. Okay, so in this session, I'll talk about the origins of CBME and what we mean by CBME. I know you know everybody in this room is a CBME leader, but I'll remind us just to have the same words. I'll talk about the development, the journey. I'll talk about some of the implementations. I'll talk about the challenges, because the organizers asked me to talk about the journey of implementing CBME and how hard it is. I started working on CBME in 1994, and all of my gray hair is from CBME. Why do so many innovations fail in healthcare? There is lots of evidence to say that we come up with innovations often, but it's difficult to get them to frontline practitioners, whether it's in education or business or in healthcare. One of the studies says it takes, on average, 17 years before a clinical innovation is widely adopted. That is a very strange thing in this era where information is so readily available. Let me set up the education story of that. Is 2 programs in my hospital who have been using EPAs for a number of years. In one of them, EPAs are a bad word. The residents, they don't like EPAs. They sound like more work. The attending surgeons, they're irritated when they're asked to fill out an EPA. They don't like doing direct observation. They're very busy. They have their own work to do. They're very frustrated that the program is at risk when the accreditation comes because they don't do EPAs well. The same program on the same floor of the same hospital is completely the opposite. The residents see EPAs as a wonderful tool to help their career. They ask the attendings for direct observation frequently, small observation, not long, few minutes of little tasks. The attendings quickly record some observation and give them useful coaching feedback. And in this program, it's very robust. The trainees are on an accelerated path because they have lots of evidence of competence. Some of them graduate early, and some of them have more flexible elective time to do other things. Why is it that those 2 programs are side by side and they have such a different experience with CBME? This is what I'm going to talk about today. If you want to see more about this, it's actually studied. One of my colleagues is Yusang An. He's originally from Korea. He's now in my city. He re-entered and trained in our program because he wanted to experience competency-based medical education. He graduated early, and now he's our medical education fellow, and this is his study. He looked at these programs, why they have such a difference. Let's talk about the journey of CBME. In The Lancet, Julio Frank wrote a paper in 2010 that said, medical education and health professions education over the 20th century has evolved dramatically. It went from apprenticeship, where we work in somebody else's practice until they said, that's enough time, you can move on. And now it's very structured, and we're moving into this competency-based, systems-based era. That's what they declared in 2010. Very famous paper. But on the ground, CBME is still in early days in many places in the world. But I would say that on every single continent, there are groups working on CBME. As was mentioned this morning, and one of the speakers in the opening remarks, the World Health Organization called for CBME in 1978. This report is on the website. You can find it right now. It's a PDF. And when they released it, it was way ahead of its time. And guess what happened next? Nothing. And that's because the world wasn't ready. We didn't have the techniques and the technology to implement CBME right away. It sat on a shelf for 20, 30 years before we really picked it up again in my generation to try and figure out ways to do what they were advocating. Their rationale was, we can train better. Every health profession all around the world, we can do better. we can make people better prepared to serve. So this is what's driving CBME. If someone asks you, and I'm sure they will at some point because you're asking them to do something differently, why are we doing this? It's because we have evidence of all of these things. We have evidence that a fixed time training system leaves graduates with gaps. If everybody graduates at the same time, some people will leave less well prepared for practice in some aspect. We know that not everybody learns at the same rate, so we need flexibility in the system to accommodate that. Society has increasing expectations of us. We know that we have some problems with our traditional ways of doing assessment. In my generation and training in Canada, which everybody was very proud of, I had one piece of paper filled out retrospectively about a month later, 12 times a year. That was my entire assessment system for workplace-based assessment. We know that there are some problems with supervision because over the last 50 years, our teachers have been given more work and they have less time to directly observe our trainees. And there are many problems. And in most countries in the world, governments don't feel we're producing the workforce that's needed in various ways. So there are lots of papers about this. Why is there so much variation in our practice? And it's because the 20th century method was very good for the time, but now we know better. We need to do something a little different. This is one of my favorite health services researchers. This is David Ash in the United States. And one of his clever studies was he looked at a database of obstetricians and he looked for variability in their outcomes. Some of you may know these papers. And what he found was there was an enormous difference in the complication rate of obstetricians in the US. This is an example of what our 20th century system produced. These are good people, these are good doctors, they are dedicated to their patients, but there's a 30% difference in their complications in their practice. Why is that? David Ash looked at it. It has to do with their training. Their teacher's complication rate was passed on. So we need to optimize every training program because it impacts people's careers for their entire lifetime. Very important. So we are in the competence business. That is why we're in this room. We are dedicated to our next generation to make them even better than our training and so that they treat patients even better. I sometimes joke when I'm teaching other people about medical education that someday I may wake up on a stretcher and I'm looking up at somebody, they better be very good. So I'm very invested. So this is the rationale for the new system. Time-based training, the 20th century model equals variable graduates, variable competence. There are some problems that we need to address, and we have evidence of things that work better. We just need to figure out how to implement them. And the WHO has been asking us since 1978 to do so. It occurs to me when I look at the whole world that these innovations can be driven by new ideas or they can be driven by suboptimal outcomes. And in the case of CBME, I think it is both. So what is CBME? You all know this. Here's my English words for it. CBME is just an approach to designing training that is very focused on the abilities of graduates. That's it. It's just an approach. It is not special in any way other than we think it's better. We think it works better. It asks 5 questions, and maybe you would phrase this a different way when you do a talk like this. But for me, it's what are the abilities of graduates? How can we sequence training from novice to expert? How can we enhance that teacher-trainee interaction? What learning activities are really needed to ensure all the competencies are acquired? And how can we use best practices in assessment? These are the core components of CBME, as laid out by the international CBME collaborators. CBME is also attractive because it has a beautiful philosophy of no trainee left behind. It's developmental. Human beings travel at different speeds, and that's okay. We must ensure that every graduate has all of the competencies needed. So if you put all that together, these are the international CBME collaborators' 5 core components, as written by Elaine Van Mel. It's in academic medicine. So there were lots of innovators around the world. They expanded the definition of competence. We moved away from just the definition of medical expert only, and we met the needs that society was asking. We looked for communication skills and systems-based practice and leadership in healthcare and so on. If you look at Brown University in the 1990s, They were very innovative because they defined roles of their graduates. And their graduates had to have the ability to serve all of those roles, physician as communicator and so on. A project I was involved in as a medical student was called EFPO, and it developed roles and competencies for all physicians. And they became mandatory in Canada, and they became our CanMed system. And the Royal College picked that up. The ACGME at the same time was working on their outcomes project, so they developed competencies. In the UK, it was the GMC competency framework. So in the 90s, we were writing down expanded definition of competence. There were some very clever innovators that I'm sure you've heard of. In the Maastricht Medical School in the Netherlands, they developed and implemented programmatic assessment. They were trying to ensure that they sampled so many different things of how their medical students were progressing. And graduation was not based on exams and marks. It was based on completing a portfolio. In Toronto, the orthopedic surgery program implemented time variable CBME, where trainees spent time with 2 or 3 trainees with a master surgeon in a lab working on skills before they went and operated on patients. And these people were so skilled they would graduate from their training programs early. Ola Tenkate, who's spoken here in Taiwan, and his colleague Fede Shiel, they invented EPAs as another way of framing these important abilities that society delegates to us. At the same time, Eric Warm in Cincinnati developed something he called OPAs, completely independent of Eric Warm. And then there's lots of innovators that continue all over the world. Another North American example is the EPAC program, where medical students go from being in their medical school, and if they want to be a pediatrician, they can have this accelerated time variable track and become a pediatrics resident through competencies. So it's a global movement. Taiwan's on my list. I always use this slide all over the world. Everybody's working on this. We founded the International CBME Collaborators because we knew so many different authors were working on this in silos. We didn't have conferences like this yet in the early 90s, so we moved to develop this international collaborative group. We actually asked that group to describe their own CBME programs, all of these leaders from around the world. And so we used the 5 core components, and we used this little radar plot diagram, and we wanted to know, are you working on assessment? Are you working on competencies? Are you working on sequencing? What's interesting is not everybody did all the 5 core components right away. It varies. So if you right now are working on assessment, that's okay. Same with all of these other leaders. If you are working on competencies, that's very common. That's typically around the world. That was the journey my country did. Not everybody does everything all at once, but I'll just emphasize to you, CBME is not an assessment system. CBME has enhanced assessment. It is one of 5 criteria. We tend to think about only assessment. But you can see all over the world, different programs, they started in different ways. And I just want to emphasize that variability to you. This is not published yet. So here are some patterns that I want to reflect back to you from around the world. First of all, there seem to be 3 different patterns for how a country starts CBME. Sometimes it bubbles up from innovators, as in Taiwan. There are some innovators in this room who are pioneers, and they're always thinking ahead, and they've helped all of us talk about CBME here in Taiwan more. Sometimes it comes down from a regulator, like an accreditation body, and sometimes it comes down from a government. And my observation is it works best when all 3 are aligned. But in many countries around the world that I'm asked to come and do this talk or other things like that, often it's government that says, you should do CBME. You have to do CBME by next year. And then people invite people like myself and the other speakers. And sometimes when I go to ask government, what do you mean by CBME? What exactly are you looking for? They say, we don't know, but it's very important. And that's okay. That gives us some flexibility. I often see when CBME is required in a country, sometimes what you see is we do CBME, and there's actually no change in the program at all. They just say they do CBME. Sometimes what I see, and this is the most common, is a group defines the outcome competencies of their graduates in a way they never did before. That is very helpful. That influences everybody. That is the most common way to start, and that's what we did in Canada. We started there in 1990. Usually people move to assessment next, or sometimes they do assessment first, and they start changing their assessment system. More direct observation, more EPAs, more programmatic assessment. It's only later that people move to curriculum design that's different. And I just want to caution all of us, if we stop at assessment, it often frustrates people. The trainees just feel like they're the most assessed people on the planet, and they don't feel like anything's changed on the teaching and learning side. It's to us to align the whole system. That's when CBME really works best. Let's talk about some of the challenges before I wrap up. Often innovations meet reality and then, things happen, crashing. Here are some quotes about CBME that I've heard all over the world in various languages. CBME is the future. We have to do it. CBME has transformed our training for better. CBME is hard but necessary. I like all of these phrases. They're good. At the same time, I hear CBME is a disaster. It's the apocalypse. I had a resident union tell me that in one country. CBME is only supported by editorials. There's no evidence, so I'm not going to do it. CBME is too hard to be useful. That's a very common one. People struggle with implementing. There are critiques that have been published in the literature, some of them scathing, some of them very personal, where people are frustrated by imposing a new system. People always resist change. It's part of being human. But sometimes it's a very powerful statement. Here are the common challenges we see all over the world, and I know that you have experienced them here. Teachers are burnt out. Teachers are too busy. Learners are burnt out. Learners are too busy to do something new, anything new. There's a lack of resources to do new education. There's a lack of infrastructure. In one country where I helped to roll out CBME, there was no technology to gather the assessments. So before they implemented that, they used paper. So they had boxes of paper, which frustrated everybody. It did lead to hiring many, many more secretaries. Lack of support from leaders can undermine. Lack of know-how is a big one, and a lack of collaboration, everybody working in silos. That's everywhere. Here's what we did in Canada. I want to give you an example of an implementation, but there are 50 more countries that we could use. This is just the one I know. When we moved from CBME, we started with CanMed's competencies. That was our big innovation. We did that for years. And then we moved to make new programs that used all of the core components. And then we implemented EPAs, direct observation. At the same time, we changed the accreditation system to look at new things. We changed the exams. We changed the timing of things. And we made our training programs in the postgraduate space time variable. So a trainee could leave the program fully certified early if they could demonstrate all of the competencies. And that was a promise we made to the trainees for a new system. Very few did, but it's not because they weren't good people or people weren't buying in. It's because medicine's hard. It takes a while to be very good, but some people did. We used EPAs in a developmental way, not as an exit assessment. So in most programs around the world, especially in undergraduate programs, like an MD program or a nursing program, there's a terminal set of EPAs. We use them as sequenced. We made small EPAs and bigger EPAs and bigger EPAs and so on. And we did that because we wanted to look at trainees' progress. We wanted to sequence from novice to expert. It worked really well for us. We also wanted to implement something called the growth mindset you may have heard of from Carol Dweck. The growth mindset has been shown to have a 20% improvement in performance, but it's a change from what most of us experienced, because most of us got into medicine or nursing by having high marks, and we defined our performance by our score. But in CBME, it's not our score. It's about our ability to help that next patient. So we wanted to incorporate that. We wanted them to think like Olympic athletes or astronauts, and less about thinking like students. We implemented competence committees. You have those here. It took us a while to be good at this. A competence committee is a different way of thinking about promotions. It requires more data. It took us a while to have good graphics. Like I said, some programs use paper, but now it is the most beautiful thing that we've implemented. People compliment who have implemented it in Canada. It's the thing they like the most. We were able to use data analytics because we had new software, and it allowed us to do learning curves for the first time. In my own program, in my hospital, in the emergency program, I stole this slide from Martin Pusick, but our program looked like this. We had several trainees on the top line, they were getting better, and we had a trainee at the bottom who was flatlining, not getting better on the EPA assessments. This person we could find in 4 weeks. In the old training system, we wouldn't find them till the second year. Learning analytics are very powerful. We knew we had challenges, and this is just like all around the world. Doing direct observation, recording EPAs, this was new and hard. We also knew we had benefits. The teachers and the learners said they loved that the Competence Committee had a better picture of trainees. So the lessons for us when we did research on our programs that were doing well and not doing well, these are lessons for us all. Program where the CBME is challenged, the program leaders have no time to do anything new, let alone CBME. The leader is not on board and endorsing things. Anything that is CBME is added on top. Nothing was taken away. There was no reimagining the program. The Competence Committee is not functioning. Maybe their software is not working. That was the profile of our programs that weren't working. We're frustrated. But the programs that were doing well were the opposite. The program director had time to think. The program education team remade the whole program. They made a new blueprint. They mapped out the competencies. They sequenced it. They assigned EPAs to certain rotations and experiences. And they had feedback for faculty. And they had a system that worked. And the residents were oriented to the new system with ongoing reinforcement. So there's lots of variability in programs around the world. Let's just talk about that. I was asked to mention implementation science. Implementation science says we should look through these lenses. We should look at the nature of the innovation, the context, the people, the design. All of those things are important, but most of us, when we do change, we think of change as a sequence, like it's linear. And that's actually not useful when it comes to something like CBME. It's not we do this step, then this step, then this step. Actually, we need to do many steps at once. Med-ed change is complex. There are many uncertainties, and it's all local. So there's no way that anybody in this room could just take my program and do the same thing. It's different. It's always in context. I couldn't implement your program in mine. It always has to be adapted. It's complex. Also, telling people how to do it is not good enough. It doesn't change behavior enough when people are so busy. What we did learn, though, was that implementing CBME depends a lot on where a program starts. So if the faculty, the teachers are interacting regularly with the trainees and they have opportunities for direct observation, it's easy for them to do EPAs. If they never see each other, it's hard. This is an example of a paper, one of my favorite papers from Karen Hauer. She looked at the early years of competence committees in the US, and for the first while, there wasn't a lot of change or a lot of alignment with the intention at the Competence Committee. They were looking for people who should fail. But that's not the spirit of CBME. CBME is developmental. Every trainee, how can we help them move along? So that's called fidelity. And often when CBME programs are struggling, it's because there's low fidelity. What was intended wasn't done. There's also this idea of integrity, which is the spirit of what we intended being done, not just that they have a competence committee. And the other thing I want to mention is that CBME change requires a change inside each person who's participating, because it's not just a new form. It's a new way of thinking. So those of us who are change leaders, we need to help our colleagues think differently. This is not a memo that we put out. It's not a video that we make. It's all of the conversations we have with all the many people in our system in order to help them see the world differently. This is Elaine Van Mel's transformative change iceberg model, and the bigger the change, the deeper you have to go. Okay, so in this session, I mentioned to you these common challenges that we all have. We have to use every channel possible, and this is what we did in Canada. It's what I do with other groups around the world. We used accreditation standards, and we used workshops, and we used videos, and we used websites, and we use awards, and so on. We made a logic model to ensure that we mapped everything that we intended to happen and what we thought the mechanism was. So all change ends up being local. It's always in context. It always takes a community to build a program. Transformative change involves helping people think differently. So, facilitating change, big lessons. It takes a village to co-develop the change, just as you're doing here. We need to map the mechanisms of the change that you intend and make sure it makes sense for your system. We need to help the teachers in so many ways. We need to help the learners in so many ways. We need to help the organizations do this because the hospitals and universities involved also need to adjust. We need to align the system so that the standards match the intended behaviors. We need to shrink the change. I call this front office, back office. Make it as small as possible for the frontline people to implement. We need to evaluate and iterate because it is never perfect the first time we roll it out. And we need to make it normal. And we keep our eyes on the prize, which is that we are dedicated to the next generation of learners and their patients. I want to leave with this thought that because it's a complex change, you can't just make it so. You can't just tell it. That you must allow for the system to unfold, and that takes patience. You can never direct a living system. You can only disturb it. Thank you for the honor of speaking to you.
Thank you, Jason, for your very informative speech and very wonderful talk. And the talk is now open for questions from the audience. Is there any question? Maybe I can take the privilege to ask you the first question. You mentioned about the time variable of resident training. It is currently in Taiwan, usually our resident training program is fixed. For example, for a neurosurgeon, we have 60-year training program. And because they should be exposed to enough experience in patient management. And from the CBME course, you just mentioned the time can be shortened, but some residents can be prolonged, right?
Yes.
Okay, so it is a variable program. How do you persuade this kind of resident program to be variable in Canada? I think it is a big challenge.
It is a big challenge. And so we did experiments first before we rolled this out. We tried it in certain programs and gave them permission to do things differently. And what we learned was most programs around the world, the residents' activities, where they serve, what rotations or posts, they're usually scheduled a year at a time. And we can adjust a year at a time as long as we know ahead of time and it doesn't disrupt the service too much. So we were able to find a way that was a hybrid in the middle. We were flexible for every trainee, and we still ensured that all of the services were covered by moving the schedule around. It was a complex jigsaw puzzle. I'll tell you, though, that in some services in Canada, we're not resident dependent for service, not always. So we have a bit of flexibility. It makes our lives easier, but we could function without them. And that allows us flexibility. For the majority of trainees in Canada, they still finish in the same amount of time as the generation ahead of them, but they have more flexibility. They have different pathways of getting there, different sequences of rotations, and more electives under the CBME system. An example is we had a trainee who was a physician before they entered our program, and they had delivered lots of babies in the past. We were able to assess that, and then they didn't have to do an obstetrics rotation for emergency medicine because we were confident in their competence. That gave them extra time to do something else that maybe they needed more training in. So it's possible to do time variable and still cover all the services.
And any other question? Should have more question, I think. Okay, I will ask you the second one, sure. If there's no question. Okay, because for the entrust, to entrust one resident, not just entrust him or her currently, we should entrust the resident in the future, right? Okay, so how do you determine we can entrust the resident now and also in the future?
Sure. So here's what the psychology evidence says. It says that actually competence is variable even for all of us in practice. We have good days and bad days. We have hard patients and easy patients. if you change the setting of somebody who's very good, they have to adjust. So competence varies day by day. What we said in our system was, when the frontline teacher makes a direct observation about a task, we ask them to record it very quickly, just a sample of we call it an educational biopsy, a little sample of their ability. They are not making a future entrustment decision, but they are asked to score, on this task today, how much did I have to do, the teacher? And so that's a retrospective view of entrustment. But the competence committee makes decisions prospectively. They bring all the data together, and then they make, when they are confident that they have enough data, they say, going forward, this trainee is entrusted to do all of these things. In our system, since we sequenced it, it allowed people to be promoted to the next stage. And when they tell the team, you know, I'm in this stage, everybody understood what they were entrusted with. So there you go.
Hi, Petro.
Jason, a wonderful conversation. Thank you very much. I just want to go back to the sequence of learning. I was just talking to Laura here. I mean, we got this frame for us that it's very difficult to change that sequence. What would be your thoughts in terms of all those 5 domains in the female framework for CBME, if one of them, specifically the sequence of learn, it's kind of fixed? Would that change, or it's that necessary, or how do you look at?
So remember I said the core components, everybody does it differently. It's always in context. But the ACGME system bakes in the sequence of learning through the milestones. So you're measuring that sequence. Even if you may not be changing rotations or activities, the competence committee is thinking about each trainee in all those dimensions, and they're sequencing them by assigning a milestone score. So it's just another way of doing it. We saw all that experience, and then we wanted to take it one step further by allowing flexibility for the sequence of activities. And we made these smaller EPAs than bigger EPAs so that it was a stepwise progression. But we just basically took the milestones and made them vertical instead of horizontal.
Well, thank you.
Thanks, Jason. It's always so good to hear about CBME, and every time I hear about it, there's something else that interests me. One of the things that you spoke about in the interventions that you implemented is the growth mindset. I think that is something very important for both the learners as well as the faculty. I'd like to hear some examples of interventions that you have used to promote that or integrate that.
So just to remind everybody, the growth mindset is the idea of not yet. So if one of us is learning something, music or tennis or medicine, sometimes we have, and someone looks at us, we have not yet achieved a level that you want to aspire to. In the fixed mindset, that's a failure. And a failure is something to be avoided, it's something bad, and it reflects poorly on your character. And you can see that's very much part of our society. We're an achievement-oriented society. But that is not how elite athletes think. And that is not how astronauts are trained. They are trained, you're not yet good at this, keep going. Use this opportunity, this failure, as a gap that somebody has given you the gift of identifying, because now you can fill that gap. I love that philosophy. I coach hockey. I'm Canadian, of course I coach hockey. I coach elite athletes, and I coach little tiny kids, and I use the growth mindset. So how do we bring it to medicine? We started by talking about it. And then people realized, oh yeah, there's a word for that thing, you know, that different way of thinking about things. And the truth is, most of us have fixed mindsets for things from childhood, and there are some things, if you work really hard, you can get better at. I am working on it. When our residents arrive in our program, we orient them for a week just to the design of the system that they're entering. We want them to stop thinking like students. We want them to think like astronauts and elite athletes and our colleagues. We want them to think like they're hungry for every observation, and they're hungry for people pointing out when they're not good at something, because it's safe. We will not fail them. It's a growth point that they can get better at. What's magic about that, the trainees who take that to heart and feel safe to do that, is I hear them asking my colleagues for more observations. I hear the conversations are safer and more productive because they become a coaching conversation. I saw you do this today. Here's what you can do next. Here's how you do it better. Tomorrow, let's do that. That's so much better than, yeah, read more, right? So much better. Better conversations are happening. Some of the trainees, it's very hard to internalize a growth mindset. They avoid the observations. They're worried about looking bad. They wait until they've done it 40 times before they get an EPA observation. So we tell them in our orientation, I don't want you to be born a 5. Do you know what I mean by that? I don't want to see your EPAs empty until you were a 5 on our scale. That's bad, we tell them. What I want to see is a growth curve. We'll promote you on the slope of your growth curve. It changes behavior. I don't know if that helps.
Okay. Thank you, Jason, for your very wonderful talk and very wonderful Q&A. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, because of the limitation of time, we thank Professor Jensen Frank again for his wonderful talk. Thank you.
好，非常谢谢 Dr. Jensen 给我们精彩的演讲，还有各位精彩的提问。接下来我们恭请高雄长庚医院龚嘉德副院长以及中医大儿童医院王志尧院长上台为我们主持第2个演讲，主题是台湾实施 CBME 10年的反思以及未来的民主共创之路。
龚嘉德副教授是高雄长庚医院副院长，同时也是台湾急诊医学会理事。那王志尧院长是亚太过敏气喘及临床免疫学会后任理事长，并担任国际过敏组织教育委员会的委员，担任国际过敏期刊及亚太过敏期刊的主编。我们掌声欢迎2位座长。
Okay, distinguished guest, and it's my pleasure to attend the second Taiwan CBME week. The first Taiwan CBME week was in 2019. CBME has achieved important achievement in Taiwan in the past 10 years. From milestone EPA to working place assessment, CCC to even program evaluation committee. Almost every teaching hospital was familiar with these words. The Ministry of Health and Welfare also encouraged various societies to include the CBME in the specialty physician training program, even in the list of hospital accreditation. But we also face the next stage of challenge, including we all want to know what has changed and what has affected in the past 10 years. And how to, from partial innovation to comprehensive population, and how to combine existing evidence based on the theory into daily practice application in Taiwan's very complex medical environment. The conference especially invited Dr.周致丞from Taiwan, who is active in the international CBME organization, and he is very active in the promoting CBME in Taiwan. What he wants to share with us today is the 10 years reflection of CBME implementation in Taiwan and the future with democratic co-production. Dr. Zhou Zhicheng is the director of CFD in China Medical University Hospital, also the chair of task of CBME in Taiwan Society of Emergency Medicine. Also, he is inaugural member of International CBME Executive Committee. Also is a faculty member of EPA international course under the professor of Ola Kente and the international faculty team. So we welcome Dr. Zhou Zhicheng.
谢谢2位座长的介绍。那谢谢所有的与会的这个医学教育的伙伴们。那有我们聚在一起，这个脚步就有往前迈进的机会。所以今天真的是非常感谢大家这个莅临中国医药大学，那让我们在过去的基础上继续一起前进。那今天这一个十年的反思，的目的是要看往我们的下一步。那我们的下一步在哪里呢？刚刚座长有介绍，我有在国际的一些参与。那我很感谢这一份演讲里面有不少的这个 slides 其实是从相关的课程或机构里面这个授权使用的。那首先呢，永远出发都不嫌方向，再次看一下我们的初衷。我们的目的是什么？我们是希望培养出符合在地情境、能执行专业、达到预定精熟程度，且满足在地需求健康照护的专业人员。那在这一个目的底下 ，Lancet 2010告诉我们这一个教育改革的方式。过往我们的课程是怎么编制的？我们打开教科书，把所有的章节看一遍。那对应的就是安排相关的章节的授课跟考试。可是，在 CBME 底下，我们必须先回到初衷：我们医疗要提供的服务是什么？而我想要得到什么样的照顾？当这样的照顾可以在地被定义的时候，我们的目标就是培育我们每一个医疗专业人员可以提供这样的照护。那这样的教育模式，当然就要起始于定义在地的需求，而我们的课程呢，不再是知识导向的考试去对应知识的内容。而是另外2个端点：知识的课程以及评量，去对应我们想要达到的目标。在这一个关键底下，大家反而会发现，考试好像看起来没有直接对应课程。为什么？不是所有的重要的事情都能够被测量。这个是一句重要的名言。也不是所有能被看到跟测量的事情都是重要的事。但是测量这个评量加上课程，支持了一个人的学习，去迈向我们的目的跟目标。那刚刚 Jason 其实也提了这一个5个核心的要素。那这5个核心的要素呢，除了有一个能力的框架，框架底下有描述进展的顺序，那再来最重要的，我最喜欢的就是有量身定做发生在师生之间的互动，以及为了促进能力学习的教学跟课程，这才是关键。而系统性、计划性的评量，是在这个教与学的过程当中，顺手每一次的相遇收集的资料点，来汇聚成这个人的成长曲线。那在台湾呢，原本的这5个 co-component 是 evaluating the implementation of CBME。那当我们想从另外一个角度，我们想要开始实施 CBME 的时候，那我们可以把它想成3个面向。为什么呢？因为这5个因素、5个要素呢，在前2个有它自己的 target audience。那我们来想想看，定义框架跟定义这个专业内容的进展，通常会是谁？大概都是领域的专家，可能是专科学会，可能是学校的老师。那结合上当然在地的需求，那也会有群众的参与。那第2个 group 是什么？量身定做的教与学，它发生的场域是在第一线师生互动之间。那最重要的是，这个师生的互动能够促进这样的能力进展，而安排的课程跟经验铺路、临床铺路，也都能支持这样能力需要去 practice、需要去反复的精熟的过程。那所以这个是在 frontline 发生的事情，是第2个 dimension， 也关于课程。而第3个呢，通常是什么？通常是在地的机构，它需要有在地的评量系统。可能大家一想到的就会是数位系统。我要收资料。我们怎么每一家医院可能都不一样，所以现在医策会有一个很努力在提供一个最基础大家可以参考使用的，譬如说像医买位这样的系统。那这是一个好的发展方向。那很关键的是，大家还记得 Jason 的5芒星吗？所有的人呢，常常都是第1个 dimension， 或者直接跳，有了1就跳3。但是什么东西不见了？ 在教学现场的东西不见了。那我们有一个俗语啊，叫“不教而杀，谓之孽”啊。那为什么第一线的师生会觉得挫折？如果我们有了这一个描述，却直接跳评量的时候，教学却没有真实的发生，那真的就会让 CBME 变成一场灾难。那接下来我们反思一下过去10年，那我以急诊医学会为例。急诊医学会在2012提出这个5年框架，那其实后来他走了10年，就是慢慢走，快快到。一开始我们就 propose 这一个整体的架构，我们6大核心能力要跟我们的急诊的EM model 急诊执业模式去做结合，来转译出对我们自己的能力描述。那这个描述的这个依序的sequence。依序的描述，我们选择了 milestone， 但是我们知道所有的东西需要被整合，你所有的能力需要被整合进去你做的事，所以我们一开始就决定，我们后面也会发展 EPA。那最重要的是，这些架构最重要要被安排跟镶嵌进去课程。我们以为5年可以做到，可是到现在都已经10几年了，其实下面还是没走完。那这也呼应了成长，其实就是一个不断往前走。那或许没有终点，才是最好的终点。那这是我们一开始的相关的 pilot 的计划。那当然也是聚焦在第一个 dimension， 就是能力的描述。描述完之后 ，validation 就会做什么？做评量。所以不免俗的，其实我们在急诊医学会做的也是1、3，最后才开始接触2。那在那个pilot到2018一个小段落的时候呢，很荣幸就有了我们第一次的各个机构的合作。那我觉得这是一个很好的契机。台湾其实资源不多，那我们的人口、我们的资源、我们的学校，那尤其在这么我们又要提供这么可亲性、可近性，就像张董事长讲的。什么都要好的状况之下，这个资源的平衡其实是非常的重要的。所以呢，我很珍视跟珍惜可以这样跨机构的来合作。那我们有了第一次的这个 CBME 周。那当时呢，在聚焦1跟3，在那一个脉络底下，第一届开出来的系列性的课程跟研讨会，聚焦的第一个是CBME 的 co-component 跟最新的进展，先让大家厘清定义。那接下来办的是什么？右手边的是医师跟各个职类的 program director 的 workshop， 怎么去发展你们的 milestone 或 EPA， 怎么去运用它设计课程跟进行评量。那再来，在北医的场次做的就是，开始介绍。怎么做 summative 的 assessment 的概念，也就是导入 CCC。那4年匆匆就过去了，这是2019的时候，我在09店，将近100个，31个专科都有人报名，100个 program director 齐聚在这边，用工作坊的方式来学怎么做，从定义。milestone EPA 到做评量，到设计课程，那这个是一个互动的 workshop。那同时那是在中医大的场次，那这个在国泰的场次呢，11个职类，也是将近100多个人 program director。那每一桌大家可以看墙壁被画得满满的，都在思考，他们在这3个 dimension 应该怎么开始跟怎么设计。那这个是在北医，大家聚下来，如果我真的开始有评量之后，这些资料怎么被收集起来？怎么去做这个学员能力进展的判断？那过了这几年之后呢，我们现在走到哪里？所以呢，我们办了这一次的2024 CBME 周。首先我们做的第一件事就是论文征稿。那非常大家给自己一个掌声鼓励。我们在短短1个月之内 征稿有140件投稿，那入选的在初选初审有126篇入选，那62篇进入复审，那再挑出25篇决选，那上面的人呢，都是我们想要致谢的这个评审委员，大家也给他们一个掌声鼓励。而且这个海报的壁报展览呢，过程中如果大家有登录的，可能会发现它是匿名的，海报一开始的 title 都是被拿掉的，所以呢，评审们并不知道这是谁。那总共有18篇得奖，大家可以扫 QR code， 那可以看到100多篇的展览都在上面。那外面得奖的18篇呢，也在我们的这个茶叙区，大家待会可以拨拢观赏一下。那从这些论文里面，我们想要看到什么？我们想要看到这4个面向。第一个，第一线真实发生的事情。我们第一个主题是学习者在能力导向医学教育的叙事与反思。第二个主题是教师的故事跟反思。第3个主题是关于课程发展的论文。第4个主题是 CBME specific 的研究或创新。那我以其中一篇我们的特优的学生的作品，我觉得它反映了我们过去10年的推动，那也呼应了刚刚 Jason 讲的很多类似的故事。那我这里有摘要，大家可以到外面看得奖的原稿了哈。那在这个故事里面呢，这位 PGY 的学员庄医师呢，他告诉我们，一开始呢进到医院，6大核心不过就是评鉴的时候提到老师耳提面命的关键字。那接下来呢，又来了个 EPA， 这是他的 initial response， 又来了个 EPA， 那其实好像老师也搞不清楚那是什么。那我们当然也不会觉得好吧，那就又是个功课，应该对我学习未必有帮助。那所以大家就在相安两无事，你放松，我也放松，那大家就让这个事情一起顺利的，该做到的事有被做到。但是随着时间的进展，越来越深刻的推动之后，我们的学员发现，原来过了一阵子之后，在有一些 run 到的科别，他们的 EPA 真的有所不同。有了些什么变化呢？他给了他一个全新的机会，去真的认识他的训练计划，知道他要学什么。那更重要的是，老师开始在回馈的过程当中，会针对这个任务给他更深刻的指导，跟有助于他成长的回馈。然后这位学员他反思到，他开始可以感觉到，这里真的有东西改变了，它是一个典范的转移，跟以前单方向的讲课是不太一样的，教学是不太一样的。那我非常喜欢这位学员用的这一个，他说，这个10年树木，100年树人。虽然他一开始并不是觉得那么 appreciate， 可是慢慢感受到里面老师的付出，跟开始当然不是所有的都有用。但是他开始发现到里面有一些根本的不同之后，他也知道教育的改变、人的改变，树木要长10年都不够了，更何况是人跟文化的改变。那从1978到现在又经历了多少年？那这是一个契机，去让师生有更有意义的共创跟互动。来共同促进医疗品质。那欢迎大家去观赏这一个所有的得奖的必报。那基于这一个反思，我只是用一个引子。从这样学员的反思，我们可以发现，当我们前线第一个 dimension 描述越来越好，评估工具也发展的越来越好的时候，真实发生的问题是什么？就像这个学生一开始的感受是一样的。可能是关于实施的真实度，到底我们在前线有没有发生我们想要的 CBME， 会成为一个关键点。 而这一个关键呢，我们可以看到几个国际的 paper， 我们并不孤单。怎么说呢？以这一个这个 medical teacher 的 paper 来看到，在做 CCC 的时候，他们发现有非常多的variability。那这个是一个研究聚焦在全国性的评估来看能力委员会在实际发生的时候的实施的真实度。那他们提供一个见解，虽然这个非常的不同，他们讶异于这个的异质性，但是这是一个重要的观点，我们必须去聚焦实施真实度的 data。那这是另外一篇在 academic medicine 的，那一样聚焦研究，大家都觉得 CBME 里面有很多评量的负担啊，那它是个 burden。那这一个研究团队去看，在每一个计划里面，到底这些评量是怎么被做的？那他们关键的分析发现，一样是一个全国性的研究，发现呢，里面关键有3个主轴被分析出来。第一个是大家对评量 CBME 的评量，其实有非常迥然不同的 mental model。那第二个，进行评量的程序也有很大的差异跟歧义。那第3个呢，是要进行这个 performance 的 review 跟 decision making 的时候，更是下一个阶段的挑战。而里面谈到去辨识出的这些关键的议题呢，在下一篇 paper 我很喜欢它的标题，那就呼应了我们学员讲的10年树木100年树人。我们不是在做短跑竞赛，教育跟人的成长一样，它都是马拉松，所以是 not yet 的问题，不是我们做的不够好。那如果你把它用一个短跑来冲刺，我们很快就力竭，就停滞了。但是就一个马拉松，你会去享受沿途过程的风景。那在这个研究里面，也是去辨识整个这个用个案的分析，整个在加拿大急诊的 training program Queen's University， 那多个相关的 program， 那发现关键也是在缺乏 frontline 教师跟学生的 share mental model。那从这一个几篇文章，它其实都是在辨识什么？它不是在辨识它 CBME 有没有效，它是在辨识 CBME 怎么落实到日常生活。那这里就有一个很重要的概念，就是这一次的主题 Implementation Science。那什么是实施科学或实施研究呢？最关键的就是想要去了解已经被证实有效的方法或实证，怎么真正落实成人们的日常生活。就像医疗重视实施研究一样，教育也应该回过头来看我们的实施研究。如果一个教育的真实度，我要想说，回馈到底有没有效？但是现场发生的回馈根本就不是你想的回馈，那你做的这个，即便你想要努力的做一个准实验研究，这个出来的结果可能也是徒劳无功。而它跟我们有什么关系呢？大家都知道转译医学，就以我们最熟悉的医学来比喻，转译医学有从 T1、T2 到 T3。那 T1、T2 其实都在研究这个东西的有效性。那 T3 是它有效之后，有没有办法做成日常的？有没有办法设计跟变成系统中可行的方式？可是最关键的 implementation research 是 after T3。即便你设计说这个制度这样是可行的，可是你更重要去看这个制度落实成日常生活之后，它有哪些阻碍，或有哪些促进因素，可以让它真正发挥效果。那这才是 implementation research， 是 the stage after T3。就是你的方法可以转译成标准的做法跟系统可操作的方法之后，你还要看 大家日常是不是真的能做到？而这所谓的日常，就跟前面几篇 paper 讲到的，就会涉及你的 mental model， 你怎么想这件事情的，你怎么进行这件事情的，大家想的是不是一致？那在这一个 implementation research 的时候呢，最重要的就是去看，我是不是能够让这个已经转化成已经证实有效，又变成是我们的系统性的做法的时候，去看这个系统性做法人们日常做到的真实性，那去看到什么是可以促进它，跟什么是它的阻碍。那在公共服务跟这个公共管理里面，其实已经研究这个很多了，因为他们其实就是在研究人们怎么遵守这些规定，怎么执行这些操作这些系统，让它变成人类真正日常的生活。所以呢，我要关注的是今天后续，Jason 给了我们一个起头。那我们这边一个转折之后呢，下面2个 talk， 一个是 co-production， 这是 focus 在 delivery of the service， 到底这个医疗跟这个教育在前线怎么传递跟发生的。那 Raghdah 会介绍 co-creation， 是前线的人怎么参与到 co-creation， 是 focus 到 shaping the design of the system。那讲到公共管理，我们就逃不了政治了哈。事实上，在这个希腊时代，亚里士多德就说，政治是科学之首，因为所有关于人类的活动都是政治，所以它是 master science。而国父孙中山先生，在很久以前就也曾经说过这样的话：政治是众人管理众人之事。而不意外的是，原本 democracy 这个单字是怎么来的 ？Demos means the people， 人们。Kratos means to rule， 所以是不是跟孙中山先生讲的是一样的事情？众人管理众人之事。而要做到民主呢，有这么多基础的价值跟素养。那我们去分析了，我们过去10几年觉得做得好的地方，大概都符合这些特质。如果你有一个 open 的 committee， 一直接受大家的 idea， 能够持续的去让 stakeholder 都能够参与，那有深层的合作，那在程序上有程序的正义，去 make a consensus， 然后去做逐步的改善，在价值上遵守，透明，让大家参与，那让它是可持续性的，这个都会是成功的经验。那我很有幸站在这一个土地上了哈，我们可以看到这个经济学人的调查，我们是蓝色的这个 full democracy 的一个地方啊哈，而下个礼拜我们就会体验台湾式的民主。但是民主是有代价的，它有时候很喧哗，有时候很多的争议，有时候呢更重要的是它很慢，感觉好像没有效率。但是呢，它是我 appreciate 的 everything。或许如果要再更有效率一点，可能会发生这样的事情。但是就像是 Jason 提到，如果一个政府它启动了这个是需要一定要做的 CBME， 但是他却不知道这是什么的时候，这就会真的是让 CBME 变成灾难。所以呢，当我们虽然走得慢，只要我们回过头，那我很喜欢这个 programmatic assessment 这个概念呢，它把过去 assessment of learning 迈向到 assessment for learning。那这一张图呢，大家可以看到，一个一个的小圆圈都是平常在做的教育训练的活动，一个一个小三角形，就在这个互动当中，如果我顺手就给了你一个回馈，那它是不是就是一个资料点？它就是个小三角形。 那被圈在一起之后，其实这就是临床的教育学，同时也就是评量资料的收集发生的一个 activity。它同时是教、是学、是评量。所以呢，评量是为了促进学习而存在，就像是你走路睁开眼睛是为了走好路，而不是看我走得多好。这一句话有点老舍。Assessment of learning 是看我走多好。Assessment for learning 我睁开眼睛是为了让我走好路，把路走好，它是不一样的意义。那中间的这个 committee 呢，是当这些活动累积够多的时候，这个曲线可以被形成，那进展就可以被决定。那最后呢，我提刚刚讲了非常多 mental model， 我们的师生都有需要了解什么是支持 CBME 落实的 mental model。首先呢，我非常爱这一篇 paper 哈，那它是个 commentary， 但是它的比喻非常的精美。胜任就跟医疗的概念是一样的，很难被定义。你只能说他不健康，但是你很难定义他怎样健康。你能判断一个学生，现在这里可能 not yet， 可是你可能很难说他，都好了。更有趣的是，我们诊断疾病不会只靠安排检验检查，所以呢，评量学生也不应该只有这个 checklist， 评量工具。而且更重要的是，即便你做了诊断，开了一堆检查，病人也不会好。所以你做了一堆评量，如果没有教学的互动的发生，学生也不会进步。那更重要的是下面，只有诊断呢？诊断它并不是一个 AI 可以取代我们今天病人送进来，1做了，2做了，3做了，4做了，那这样我们医生就没有价值了嘛，对不对？好，那教育也是一样的，它需要所有的参与者被好好的培育，那有它人性的部分在里面，才让这整个教育跟医疗在大家的共同参与底下做到最好的部分。可是很有趣的是，病人会走到你的诊间，问你说，可不可以帮我安排一个电脑断层？我很担心我怎么了，帮我做个核磁共振。可是学生呢，会躲离开你，不要看我，千万不要看我。好，所以这个是上面有很多共通点，但是却最关键不同的。而回到刚刚讲的 prospective 跟 retrospective 的概念。过去我们常常站在 fixed mindset， 就是去评量你表现的是不是完美。我们追求一个完美的工具来看学生有没有完美的表现。可是现在我们必须要往前看，他是不是 ready 了？可以，他 not yet， 但是他 not yet 的位置在哪里？我们希望他往前走到哪里？所以呢，会从 does 回溯性的评估他过去的表现是不是完美，换成另外一个观念，我是不是可以信任他？虽然情境可能不太一样，虽然这个事情他不见得发生过，但是基于他前面的东西，我能评估这个风险，他可以试着做。那这个就会转换成从看过去变成看未来，而这个看未来的动作呢，在当下它是浮动的。为什么？因为现场如果很忙，我对这一项也不熟，我能给你的信赖当然要保护你，也保护病人就会少一点。可是如果现在很犹犹豫豫，这也是我很经手的东西，那或许我可以授权的就很多。这是在现场 ad hoc 的部分。而 summative 呢，更是一个关键概念的转折。我们会给一个 statement of awarded responsibility， 我授权你能够做到什么程度？但是这个授权呢，它其实不是个结束，因为这个授权的缩写叫 STAR， 这个是星星，其实是一个开始，它是你下一阶段，因为你可以正式参与下一个阶段了。那当我们用这样子前塑性的概念来讲的时候，就会看见 coaching 的重要。那当 coaching 在发生的时候，我基于他现在走到哪里，给他非常 specific 的指引， 而不是教我想教的东西，跟告诉他你该怎么样会变得更完美，而是聚焦他走到哪里，给他跨出下一步的指引。那我们 CBME 的前线教学就会发生，而faculty development 的概念就必须要被扩张，是所有 stakeholder 的 development。你会看到包含权利，不只是 orientation， 他们也需要知道 CBME 是什么，他们怎么配合，他们要怎么看待它，才可以得到最好的帮助。那最后的总结，因为上面所有的回溯，所以我们花了半年思考设计这一次 CBME 周的各个主题，就如同缺角的五芒星的那两个要素。在 Dimension 2的部分呢，首先呢，我们今天是主题概念的 Opening Conference， 那明天呢会同时分2场，一个是在国泰前线老师，从教育者的完整蓝图愿景到工作场域怎么做 coaching、clinical coaching 的工作坊。那在北医会是能力导向的课程设计跟怎么评估你的训练计划，让它做持续性的改善。那最后呢，是我们不断的研发，在长庚会有我们的研究论坛，那同时会再有另外一个临床教练工作坊。那这是我们为了办这个 CBME 周，11月25号就在北医先办了 pilot 的课程。那有看到这是 ACGME 的 Direct Observation and Feedback， 我们把它转译成 Clinical Coach 的 Workshop。那就会看到有标准的住院医师，他真的是住院医师，但是来演标准住院医师。然后前面绿色的这个是标准化病人，老师就在观察，标准化住院医师跟病人的互动，待会要演练给他 coaching。那最后的总结，我们希望 CBME 要被什么支持呢？不只有关于 CBME 5要素。milestone EPA 内容的发展，更重要要有后面的 mental model 的支持，不只是 growth mindset， 我们要 share mental model on democratic value, on co-production, on co-creation。那程序上可以去基于这些价值，基于 implementation science 来做我们的 change management。那我永远过去的13年。我每一个 CBME 的演讲都是这一张 slide 结尾，方向对，我们永远先去看这个方向，但是慢慢走，我们会快到。那以上是我的参考文献，那感谢大家今天的聆听，谢谢大家。
So thank you for Dr. Chu, excellent talk. Now is the Q&A section. We have several minutes. Before I use the Mandarin to ask our audience any comment or any question, I would like to inquire our foreign guests. Do you have any understanding, or maybe you would like to raise some question to direct us, Dr. Chu, to elaborate using the English to answer your query? Is there any question from the foreign guests? No? Okay, please.
I repeat again, wonderful work. How did you keep your resilience throughout these 10 years and kept this group together?
Actually, I learned a lot from the CBME generally. It's helped myself a lot. Actually, I am quite anxious. I mean, a person with anxiety, personality, and a fixed mindset. But I feel I was getting improved by participant in CBME. Every time I heard about growth mindset, and I will tell myself, oh, I can try again. I just not yet. And so I just want to share this feeling. Maybe change the personality. It's caused me. I have already only evolved into current self. for 48, oh no, so many years. So I know that I'm still evolving, but I really gain a lot of inspiration from this journey, so I can keep doing this. But I still need to go to the silent meditation for 7 days without the iPhone, without any talk, to really save my body and the mind.
Right. It's just like a missionary, just try to spread your idea and get the feedback. I believe Dr. Zhou already do a lot of work and also inspire a lot of people to follow up. It's really like a missionary job. Yeah. Okay. Is there any question? Yeah, please.
I just have a comment for you more than a question, and it really is, I think, we often forget that in medicine, and you know, I think Dr. Frank mentioned it in his section as well, everything moves slower, and it is the perseverance that things do get accomplished. I can give you my own experience in that recently in a conversation with representatives from programs and institutions that we held in the US last fall. We actually had somebody stand up and say, wait, you're moving too fast. And we've been on this journey for almost 25 years in the US. And so 10 years, I know it feels like a long time, but we've been on it for 25 years and we're still not there. You know, Canada has been very fortunate that they are where they are. So keep up the good work. And I think that Taiwan is actually very far advanced in the work that you're doing. And so I applaud the work that you've been doing and where you are now. So congratulations.
Thank you so much for the encouragement.
Yeah, thank you for your comment. So I will leave it several minutes. 我要问这在座的吧，请问有没有什么问题可以请教我们周医师？哎，请，那位请。
主持人好，周医师好，谢谢非常精彩的演讲。那我是长庚医院张玉哲，人家说10年磨一剑，但是我没有看到周医师磨的是一把剑，看起来是弄了一个炼钢厂。或者是铸铁锅哦，但我们都知道说，在 CBME 的世界里面，它并不一定是完美的方式。但我们可以去 debate， 我们可以去 debate， 但是从 value creation 的 framework 里面去看，我们要投入，要有从经验里面找到知识，那甚至投入在怎样可以 apply 之后再 contextualize、realize。那在周医师你的角色有2种，一种是 top down， 一种是 bottom up。那只有 top down， 即使成功也是表浅，因为没有办法 underpin 所有的这个 workplace 的一个 everything。所以我想请周医师提供3个你过去的经验，在 top down 里面，你觉得有哪些是你观察到所有各参与机构里面，你觉得最成功、值得参考的？那在 bottom up 里面有3个最成功你所观察到的，今天在座的几乎都是 CBME 的 stakeholder 在台湾，他们可以参考。并且投入去发展，成为他们机构 CBME 的代言人，或者是投入者，或者可以 reflection， 在这个过程当中做 value creation。谢谢。
可能不见得各能3个，但是我试着举几个。第一个 top down 的时候呢，最重要的一定没有一个 top down 是真正 top down。那就像前面讲的，我看到最成功的都是这个保持 open mind。因为目标是被讨论出来的，因为这是大家的需求，所以当这个 top， 当这个主事的人，当这个学会，它是有个方向，但是 open 这一个，民主的意思是说 the participant make a say， 他可以真正决定方向，而不是他只是出现坐在那里。所以对 top down 来说，最关键的是保持这个 open 跟程序还有价值。那让内容允许它现在可能不完美，但是我们可以就像张教授的研究一样，这样我们不断的产出啊，不断的在更新。那这个是我在 top down 觉得最重要的。那 bottom up 其实是 在前线，也就是这一次的 CBME 周想要探讨的议题。我们到底怎么让前线的师生 join？ 那在我们这边，我们看到，我觉得最成功的都是他真正有得到这个受益，那他转身变成老师之后，那这是一个非常关键的。可是我们下一步应该更有系列性的去，像我们去参访加拿大 Queen's University 的时候，他们去培养每一个 program 的 champion， 就是里面champion teacher、champion learner， 那让他们来带领前线的人怎么真的去执行这一个教学的互动。那这个是我想到最成功跟我们可以迈向的方向。
好，那我们留最后一个问题，是不是请来问？对，就是你，
谢谢致诚演讲收获非常多。我是高一陈振生医师，我是精神科医师。想请教你，就是说，你后面那一句这个方向对我看这么多人来参加应该是没有错了那这个我想请教你，这个这么多年来那我们也很这个 outcome based 就说就您在尤其是在急诊的专科医师训练中，那你以这个导入这个 CBME， 你自己怎么样观察，或是不是有这样觉得说，训练出来的急诊专科医师的 competency 的确是有在提升中。那是有那大概你是怎么样的观察？谢谢。
这个是所有问 CBME 最困难的问题，因为这个教育是一个 complex， 它是一个复杂的介入，所以它是 multi-factor 的。但是我用一个 quick response， 因为我没有 collect data， 说我们前线医疗品质是不是变好了，但是可以回应我们现在急诊医学会办第4次全国住院医师，下个月就会办全国住院医师期中评量，那里面有 simulation 的长战，那有 OSCE 的短战，那去年就考了一题很有趣的急产。那这个就是这个 society 在思考，我们很少遇到，但是我们要确保学生会的。那就以前过去考试的概念呢，学生就会猜这个不可能模拟，好，那老师就会那个预训的时候就说这一题不用，可是结果他真的考了，我们就 try our best。但是这个可能没有直接 address 到你的议题，是说。至少现在我们的训练跟我们会随时去看到我们现在需求上可能没做好的，我们就把它转译成学会的评量跟课程。那包括我们另外一个考的是告知坏消息，那这个都是很不一样的题目，在全国的测验里面。那我们希望借由这些呢，或许下一步我们可以多做一些 implementation research。来看这些在现场被操作的如何，但是如果要直接 connect 得到医疗的 outcome， 其实困难度是非常高的，因为它是相当复杂的因素。
因为时间的关系，我们无法要大合照所以谢谢把那个周医师把那个精彩的演讲 ，Thank you for Dr. Joe excellent talk，Thank you。
谢谢周主任精彩的演讲。接下来我们进行大合照。那各位请留在位置上，跟我们一起大合照就可以了。 相信我们美味的餐点跟我们外面专业的海报也带给大家味蕾跟视觉上面的飨宴哈。那大家都非常投入，谢谢大家。那接下来我们恭请国泰医院简志成副院长以及中医大医学院林嘉德副院长为我们主持这个演讲，主题是从医疗服务到医学教育的共同生产形式。
简志成副院长是辅仁大学医学部部厅教授及临床副院长，国泰综合医院教学研究副院长。林嘉德教授是中国医药大学附设医院耳鼻喉科教授及主任，同时也是我们中国医药大学医学院的副院长。我们欢迎两位座长。
Dear colleagues and dear friends from overseas and in Taiwan, I'm Dr. Lin. It's my great honor to chair this symposium, and I think that Eric Holmboe is a very good friend to all of us, and I will give a short introduction to him. And Dr. Holmboe is a graduate of Franklin and Marshall College and the University of Rochester School of Medicine. He served as the Associate Program Director at Yale Primary Care Internal Medicine Research Program and as the Director of Student Clinical Assessment at Yale School of Medicine. He was previously the Senior Vice President for Milestone and Development and Evaluation in ACGME before 2084 as the NORA. Now he is the CEO of Intel's integration of ECFMG and Fairmere since 2024. Eric has been here in Taiwan before pandemic in 2019. Now he will give us a speech about the co-production of the formation to the healthcare delivery to medical education. Eric, can you hear me?
I sure can. Can you hear me?
Oh, yes. Oh, please. Wonderful.
Awesome.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for having me. I am really disappointed not to be there, but as you heard, I started a new job on Tuesday, so I've been pretty much drinking from a fire hose since Tuesday, and I'm just really pleased to be able to join you tonight. So as you heard, I'm going to talk about this concept of co-production and its integration with healthcare delivery and medical education. As you heard, I had the wonderful opportunity to spend 10 years at ACGME, got to work with one of my dear colleagues, Laura Egger, who I'm so glad can be there with you. And so in honor of that and the fact that most of this work occurred and was done there, I'm going to keep this on the ACGME PowerPoint template. These are just my disclosures. The only other one is I do receive royalties from Elsevier for a textbook. So here's the kind of outline for my talk today. I'm going to briefly review the impact of COVID-19 because I think it's important. It does set context about where we've been and what the implications are for where we go next in a CBME world. But I'm going to point out that we actually work with a lot of interdependencies, and I don't think those are always fully recognized. And if we're going to talk about co-production, you have to talk about interdependence. More on that in a moment. We'll talk about what co-production is, and then we'll show the link between co-production and outcomes and really where to next for us. So January, at least in the States, is a very propitious moment. The very first case of COVID-19 was diagnosed in a patient in the state of Washington in January 2020. So it's literally been 4 years. This is the case report of that patient that was published in March of 2020 in the New England Journal of Medicine. You can see the patient on the right has interstitial pneumonia. And obviously this was the start of a really tragic 4 years and a very difficult 4 years, both in healthcare delivery and medical education. And so I think we always have to keep that in mind. I like to show this slide because I think it's a touch point for us about where we were. The mural on the left was created by a Mexican artist, and this is essentially 198 photographs that have been altered, you can see, to create this depiction of a healthcare professional. And all 198 of these healthcare professionals died in the early phases of the pandemic, and they were physicians, nurses, respiratory therapists, and so forth. And what's also clear that the impact of this virus, which continues, by the way, the United States is now probably in its second largest surge per wastewater data this month that we've been in the entire pandemic. Thankfully, in a much better place with vaccines, therapies, and so the impact is very different. But having said that, this is an article from The Economist from late 2022 that showed that the actual impact, mortality impact of COVID was probably somewhere around 20 million people dying across the globe. And so that was over a year ago. Clearly, we haven't had quite the same level of mortality, but it still continues. And in the United States, 90% of the deaths from COVID are occurring in folks over 60. And so I think it's important to use it as context because the pandemic exposed some really serious issues in healthcare, and this is a partial list. So from the downside perspective, certainly we saw a severe exacerbation of existing healthcare disparities. That was certainly the case in the United States, but we know that this occurred in other countries as well. We also saw that public health systems had variable preparedness to really deal with the pandemic. And there were multiple things that were impacted, but we ran into things like personal protective equipment shortages. There were communication challenges. We saw a lot of problems with misinformation that continues to this day. And we also saw just a lack of planning for disruptions. And so when those disruptions occurred, folks really had a hard time. And some hospitals did it honestly much better than others, but the impact was highly variable. And we know that a number of healthcare services were disrupted, particularly for those patients who didn't have COVID, but still had very serious health conditions and needed health care. There were some upsides, and I don't think we want to lose sight of this. And I want to really highlight what I thought was an astounding capacity, and more importantly, the collective capability to ramp up critical science. In the middle of a crisis, we saw wonderful collaboration really take shape. Because of this pandemic. We saw a lot of data sharing. We saw amazing work on drug trials, excuse me, that were conducted in multiple countries that were stood up very quickly for drugs like hydroxychloroquine, basically show that it didn't work. And that's really incredibly important because as we look back, there's a study just released this week that showed that probably somewhere between 10 to 20,000 patients across the globe in the early phases died as a result of taking hydroxychloroquine. We had this drug that we thought was effective. It worked in vitro, but we needed to study it. And so I think we don't want to lose sight of the collaborative capability or collaborative potential that the pandemic exposed to really solve serious problems. And I think that's an important upside to keep in mind because I think that same principle holds for medical education. Our collective capacity across the globe, you're sitting there in Taiwan, I'm down in my basement here in Phoenixville, Pennsylvania, but that collaborative collective has tremendous potential to really accelerate CBME. For medical education, the pandemic exposed a number of challenges. And again, this is mostly US-centric, and so I'd encourage you there in Taiwan to see if any of these resonate with you. We've always had a heavy reliance on time and training as a proxy for competence, and that became untenable. For example, you spend X number of rotations in the emergency department with Jason Frank, or you spend X number of months at an ICU rotation, and that time in those rotations essentially became the proxy for somebody having competence in those areas. We also saw the usual proxies of assessment were also altered and disrupted, such as counting the number of cases that you do as a surgeon or the types of clinical conditions you care for as a family medicine doc. Those became unavailable because the procedures weren't being done or they just weren't getting a chance to take care of certain types of patients. And so those rotations got exposed, as I said, and even high stakes exam in the United States. We rely very heavily on those, probably too much. But one got shut down completely, the clinical skills exam, and others really had a difficult time. And then the other thing exposed, and this wasn't a new problem, but it really highlighted substantial gaps around all transitions, moving from medical school into graduate medical education, from residency into fellowship, and then from residency fellowship into practice. These have always been somewhat abrupt. They're rarely fully planned and systematic. And so that was exacerbated by the pandemic and highlighted the importance of really getting serious about those transitions. And work has been catalyzed as a result of the pandemic. We talked about further gaps in assessment, and unfortunately we saw an exacerbation of implicit and explicit bias and just outright prejudice, not only among healthcare professionals, but unfortunately in the States, a fair amount of that bias was coming and prejudice was coming from patients toward healthcare providers, through some of the very pejorative terms used, either in relation to the virus itself or to various groups who were caring for patients. So if we think about that in the context, and we now return, and Freeman alluded to this a little bit in his talk, why are we here? What's the ultimate goal of medical education? And for us in the States, our kind of North Star is something called the quintuple aim. These are 5 really important aims. One is to improve population health. The other is to reduce the cost of providing care. And as you know, the United States does this quite poorly. The third is to enhance the care experience, which really refers back to the 6 critical aims of quality. Care that has to be safe, effective, efficient, timely, equitable, and patient-centered. Now, that equitable concept is so important. It was demonstrated by the pandemic to really be so problematic that it's now been elevated into its own aim called health equity. And then finally, the 5th aim is that we have to attend to how all we are doing, because we know that burnt out, fatigued clinicians don't perform as well. They're more likely to make mistakes. That's just part of the human condition, right? We have limitations as humans. And so taking care of ourselves, self-care, and then also the importance of institutions attending to wellness is taking on new meaning. So from a medical education perspective, we have to design programs that always strive toward that quintuple aim. We have to design curricular or learning experiences based on the competency framework in use. Ours is the general competencies. Obviously, Jason, who's there with you, it's CanMeds. CanMeds is also used in a number of other countries, as are the general competencies. And then we have to design an assessment program. And Freeman did a wonderful job of laying out the critical elements of programmatic assessment. And we have to be able to define what the educational outcomes are. And we have ways of now doing that, whether they be entrustable professional activities or the competency milestones. And you've all heard the adage, assessment drives learning. That's true, but we also have to attend to the fact that learning has to drive the right type of assessment. And I think that back end of that loop sometimes gets short shrift. Finally, all of this has to occur in a high-functioning clinical learning environment. That's what the CLE stands for. It turns out that where you train really has a major impact on your abilities once you graduate. In the United States, you may be familiar with the ad campaign that what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. Well, guess what? That's not true in medical education. What happens in your institution doesn't stay there. The learners will take that with them. Now, that can actually be a good thing, because if they're learning to provide care that is of high quality, in other words, safe, effective, efficient, and so forth, they will take those abilities with them. And we're generating more and more data that demonstrates that to be the case. And so as we think about our learners, they undergo this intensely developmental process while they're with us. This is a wonderful article from Martin Pusick, but showing what a learning curve actually looks like. And so when our learners are with us in medical school and residency and fellowship, they are on the steep part of that curve. And if we layer on top of it the various stages of development based on the Dreyfus model, something that Dr. Egger knows very well, our goal for them in training at the end of postgraduate training is proficiency. In other words, they're now able to practice without supervision. And so you can see that's a very intense journey just to get to that point. But the other thing to recognize, which is really important, that they're not done. That nobody's going to come out as a deliberate expert, right? Where they continually work to be a master at their craft. We have to prepare them for that. And you'll notice that the amount of effort that's required to move toward deliberate expert at their practice actually goes up, not down. And so if they don't have the self-directed abilities to really strive toward expertise, they will oftentimes experience what's called arrested development. In other words, they'll plateau. That automatic expert line is meant to represent that. And then, as I said, we have to understand that medical education is in a set of nested relationships. Learners are nested within their programs, that are nested within institutions, that are all embedded within a local community. These are all interdependent relationships, and all of us are affected, depending on where we are, by the governmental regulations that are occurring within our various locations. And these interdependent relationships affect both educational and clinical outcomes, and they're all very important. I wish it were as simple as just that, but it's not. So as we think about that quintuple aim, we have to understand, and we think about patient-centeredness, right? And that's one of the really important parts of the definition of CBME that Jason led over 10 years ago. The patient has to be at the center. And so the patient was going to have is the series of intense interactions with the healthcare team. In this case, nurses, pharmacists, discharge planners, social workers, and so forth. In our particular perspective, the learner here is the physician learner, might be a nursing learner, and so forth. Then we have faculty, and then the training program with its policies, procedures, curriculum, all of that interacts with the patient. It may not be as direct, but those interactions are real. And we have to begin to think that educational, clinical, and healthcare outcomes are really one and the same. They should be seen as having a lot of overlap. And there's a lot of growing evidence for that. And of course, this very set of complex dynamics that you can see all these bidirectional arrows all occur within a set of clinical microsystems. Those microsystems is where care occurs. In a hospital, it's typically a hospital ward. It might be the emergency department, the radiology suite, the operating theater, and so forth. And patients will experience multiple clinical microsystems throughout their stay. If they're on a hospital ward, they may need to go down for a CAT scan. That's a new microsystem for them. And of course, this is all embedded within an institution that has its own environment and also has its own approach to performance. And then, as I said, these are embedded within community and societies, and they will affect what happens there based on their needs and how they influence the healthcare system. So the question is, how are we doing in our interdependent med-ed world? Well, not as well as we should be. So I'm going to start with some older studies that many of you may be familiar with. These are all studies that looked at the association between the hospital institutional level of quality and cost performance and the performance of the physicians who graduated from those institutions. There were two main buckets in this early work. One bucket was cost of care. Candace Chen, Bob Phillips, and Brenda Sirovitz all showed that the environment in which you trained affected your cost performance. In other words, how expensive you were as a physician after you graduated. And I'll show you an example in a moment. The other early work were complications in early practice. Ash looked at obstetrical complications, and Tina Bansal, who's a colleague of David Ash, looked at surgical complications. And all of these found an association between institutional level performance and the performance of their individual graduates. Let's just take a look at two of these studies. So this is the Candace Chen study, and what they looked at was the amount of healthcare spending that was being pursued within the environment where the learner was training. And then they followed that learner into their early practice and actually followed them out more than 15 years, and then took a look to see like what was their spending as a healthcare provider. And it turns out that if you trained in a high-cost environment, you remained a high-cost provider. And what's really interesting about that is that even if you moved into a low-cost environment where healthcare costs were better controlled, you still, as an individual, tended to stay a high-cost healthcare provider. And for those who were in the high category, right, who trained in the highest cost regions, that effect lasted 15 years. Now, it got better over time, as you can see from the effect sizes, but nonetheless, the imprint from where they trained was present 15 years later. Well, guess what? David Ash found the same thing. I won't show you the graph here or the table, but he found these kind of three things. First, where an obstetrician is trained is strongly associated with later maternal complication rates. Second, turns out experience in this study matters, and things actually got better. Not all studies have actually shown that. But in David's study, obstetricians did slowly get better with additional years of experience, and that improvement, I bet, modest, continued for up to 30 years in their study. However, what he found was the initial skill of the obstetrician, was by far and away the most important thing. So those who came out the most poorly prepared, in other words, having trained in institutions with a higher rate of maternal complications, never catch up with those who trained in the best hospitals. They do get better, but their initial point, in other words, their point of departure, their point of graduation, was the biggest predictor of what their complication looked like for the next 15 to 20 years. Excuse me. So that really looks at it using the unit of analysis as the institution where people train and what the performance was in early practice. We, with the milestones data, have now been able to take a look at what happens in early practice based on the ratings that occurred during training. And this study has just been accepted. Excuse me. And I think it's important because it brings a different lens from two different units of analysis. The objective of the study, led by Bridget Smith, with wonderful analytic work done by ACGME's Kenji Yamazaki, evaluated the association of in-training vascular surgery milestone ratings with subsequent complication rates and endovascular aortic aneurysm repair among early career vascular surgeons. This is the first 2 to 3 years of practice. What was really powerful about this study, and be something I'll come back to in a moment, is that we were able to take advantage of a registry. So we had over 4,000 patients from 208 hospitals, and we were able to look at 327 graduate surgeons. And the reason this is important is registry data is about as good as it gets. This is clinical data that's collected at the point of care, right? Unlike claims data and other forms of data, this is very rich data that's deliberately collected to drive quality improvement and performance measurements. And so our main outcome was to look at surgical complications following EVAR for patients treated by these new graduates. And here's what we found, and this is really interesting. So if we look at the patient factors, the things that predicted a higher likelihood of major complications won't surprise you. Older patients had a higher rate. Unfortunately, this has been seen in vascular surgery that females tend to suffer a higher rate of complications. And then those that were basically evaluated to be unfit for an open procedure, in other words, an open aortic aneurysm repair, also had higher rates of major complications. What's interesting is that we also saw benefit with surgical case volume. I'll bet actually quite modest. So the more cases you did, the lower your complication rate, but the actual reduction was about 1%. As you can see, the odds ratio here is 0.99. It's highly statistically significant, but the effect size is important, but a bit more modest. Here's what we are really surprised by. If you look at how the program approaches the milestone rating task, and you look at the deviation of each individual learner from what the mean milestone rating is for the entire cohort of residents, that deviation turns out to be really important. So in this example, this is from programs whose mean rating on the milestones, remember this is a 5-point scale, level 4 is proficiency, level 3 is competence, and so 3.5 is somebody who's in transition or moving toward proficiency. If you had a resident who was rated as 4.5 in that program, it said, in other words, half a scale up from proficiency, their complication rate, major complication rate, was 50% lower. Let me say that again. If they were 1 unit above their peers, the mean rating in the program, their complication rate was 50% lower than their peers from that program. Now, we also saw an interaction with the mean milestone rating, which means that how the programs approached their rating task also had an impact on what the complication risk was. In this case, for major complications, it didn't reach statistical significance, and it almost did for minor. But the thing that was really fascinating to us was that the interaction between program level performance with regards to how they rate their residents and the individual ratings they gave, there was a strong interaction effect. And so here's what it looks like on a graph. And so if we take the 3.5, of which there were a number of programs, that's the blue line, you can see pretty dramatic differences in complications rate depending on where the learner is. So the learner here was 4.5, has a complication rate that's approaching roughly about 10%. But if you go up here, right, they have a rate of, if they have a rate of 3, their complication rate's almost 25%. Now, what's interesting, for those programs whose means were 3.5 or 4, with each increasing milestone level, the rate of complication drops. Much more modest for those programs that were rating 4, which were pretty consistent, but much more dramatic for those programs that had lower mean milestone ratings and therefore more deviation among their residents. What's interesting, those programs that gave higher ratings right from the beginning, in other words, kind of, almost up to 5, actually there was a paradoxical effect. And so what this may be indicating is that these programs are engaging in leniency error. And so the behavior of the program and the individual ratings actually matter. And so this is now data that we can use to feed back to vascular surgery programs so that they can take a look at how are they rating individuals, and they can now see what the implications of that behavior is. What assessments are they using? Why are we giving these ratings? Because these ratings actually have meaning in a very common procedure that carries significant complications with it. And so now we're seeing another form of interaction like we do with institutions. This is now looking at program behavior and the performance of their individual graduates. And so we think about these studies, and there are several others now. But basically what it shows is that every system is perfectly designed to get the results it gets. It's one of my favorite quotes. I learned it from Paul Batalden. And so I would say to you, we now have multiple ongoing examples of a medical education system persistently producing variable outcomes. I just showed you examples of that. And I think the question all of us really have to begin to tackle more seriously is this really what we want? Are we comfortable with it? Let me ask you all a question. Let's say you have a loved one, maybe it's your parent, or maybe it's now a spouse if you're getting older like me, and they need a vascular surgery procedure. I want to know which one of those surgeons would you want to choose? I think we know the answer to that question. And so the question is, don't we want that for everybody? Can't we raise all boats and narrow that variation among all the trainees by really attending to what's happening in our environment, how we're approaching assessment within our programs, and how the institution is performing? So let's talk about how co-production might be helpful in this regard. So one of the really early thinkers in co-production was a gentleman named Victor Fuchs. He was a brilliant healthcare economist at Stanford. He wrote a very impactful book I read in medical school called Who Shall Live, really looking at how we make decisions around end-of-life care. This is written in the 70s. He's way ahead of his time. But what Victor pointed out, and he unfortunately died back in September, was almost, as you can see, 100 years old, so had a remarkable career. But Victor said that making a service is fundamentally different from making goods and products. All service at some level is produced by professionals and those who receive the benefit. And so Paul Batalden, building on this work, and his daughter Marin wrote a really nice article around co-production where they defined it as the interdependence of users and professionals to design, create, develop, deliver, assess, and improve the relationships and actions that contribute to the health of individuals and populations. And so co-production is about service. Both healthcare and medical education are providing service. We don't make products. I hate when we refer to our learners as a product. They're not a product. They're a professional that's entering a healthcare system to provide service. And two parties are always involved in making a service. Both parties bring expertise into that relationship, and services, are, when they're done well, are always co-produced. From the patient's perspective, they often are going to have the best understanding of their own needs, their preferences. They have a lived experience with their condition. They understand what their resources are to help them with that. And also, they're going to have a better sense many times of what their network and community offers, or we can at least begin to connect them to the community so that they themselves can be empowered to manage or co-manage a lot of their illness. And so this was depicted by Maren in a really nice graphic, where in this model, patients and healthcare professionals in the form of a team co-execute, co-plan through civil discourse to co-produce high-value healthcare service that leads to good health for all. This relationship is, again, embedded within a healthcare system and a community and society. These are nested relationships. And you'll notice that patients and professionals are deliberately depicted as being on the same horizontal. That is deliberate because we want to remove hierarchy. We want patients and professionals to be partners as they co-produce high-value care. And so there's a co-production care cycle. This was developed by Glenn Elwin and others at Dartmouth. I find this very helpful. And so you can see what that cycle is. You co-assess with the patient. How are things going? If they're coming in and they've started therapy, for example, for hypertension or diabetes, how is that going? Did it make the changes that we wanted? Do we need to make changes in the dose or your diet, whatever it may be? We co-decide on what those next steps will be based on what the patient's goals are, and we look at options, right? This is the informed decision-making that we talk about to make preference-based choices in the best interest of the patient. And then we help design a plan, a care plan, that will fit the patient's goals, context, but also capabilities. And if we need to help them acquire more capabilities, then we have to figure out how to do that. And we want to make sure to minimize the burden of the treatment. And then finally, we co-deliver and we figure out how can the patient contribute, co-produce, and what do we need to do to support them in that journey. Well, let's talk about co-production in med-ed. What does it look like? So we can easily swap out just a few words from that original diagram, and you'll notice that it holds up really well. In this case, it's learners working with teachers defined writ large, not just physicians, but nurses, the healthcare team, and so forth. Again, who co-execute, co-plan through civil discourse to co-produce not only high care value for professionals, but also high value care for patients. We now get a twofer out of this. And as I said, this is embedded within a system, in this case, both the healthcare professions education system as well as the healthcare delivery system. And so this was a nice article led by Bob Englander comparing where we've been, our kind of traditional approach to medical education, and what would it look like in a co-production model. The logic in the traditional is more of a goods model, right? Learner's product. In co-production, it's a service model where learners being prepared to be a service provider in whatever profession they're pursuing. The primary driver is no longer the teacher as expert, but now is a learner-teacher partnership. Both bring expertise into that relationship. The focus in the traditional model was, quote, input focused. What's the sequence, the number of courses, what rotations do you do? Now it looks at learners and teachers as experts in both context and content respectively, and that's where the 5 core components really come in that Freeman nicely talked about. The tailoring of the learning plans that are required. What's the proper sequencing to make sure that we're truly preparing that person for expertise? With regard to information ownership, it used to be medical schools and residencies own the information. I think that's a really bad model. I think any information collected on learners is theirs, just like a patient medical record. It's Don Berwick's adage, nothing about me without me. Learners should own their portfolios, and in the future, they have to be transportable to new schools, programs, or even into their early career. Relationships, as we've talked about, have been too siloed between basic and clinical scientists, academicians and clinicians, the different professionals. We have to think about these as an integrated activity. and integrate basic clinical and system science into a whole. And there's some wonderful work going on by people like Jed Gonzalo and others at the AMA that have really talked about health system science as really one of the new sciences we need to pay attention to. And we talked already about connections, right? We have abrupt transitions now. I think there's still a major problem. I think we need to create clear transitions, and ultimately, for really successful, they can be variable and variably time-based. I know I have a long way to go in there, but before we get to that, I'd sure like to see these transitions be more systematic. And then finally, continuous improvement is really the mindset in the co-production model. It's not a shame and blame. It's not good enough. You know, it's not a floor type of mentality. It's really about a constant cycle of improvement. So here's the co-production cycle then for medical education. Co-assess. Guess what? It's when you sit down in the United States, you're supposed to sit down every 6 months with the milestones data and basically have this very conversation. Where do I stand? How am I doing? Where am I doing particularly well? I just went through a series of clinical experiences the last 6 months. Were they effective? Do I need to make changes in my learning plan? And we do that together with the learner based on both the learner and the program's goal. And then we make not only informed preference-based educational choices, but we need to make sure they're evidence-based choices. And then we co-design that plan to fit both the learner and program's goals. And we think about what interventions can maximize outcomes. And then we work together. And here we have to think very critically about what the learner can do to contribute. Our job is to support them in their journey to reaching, again, mastery and expertise. And so if we pull this all together from an assessment perspective and a learning curve, this is actually what should be happening. That learning curve I showed earlier should be an ongoing iterative set of co-production cycles, right? As we're moving up that curve through these various stages, we need to be going through the cyclic process. We've tried to build it in with the Milestones program in the United States by building in that every 6-month touch point with the Clinical Competency Committee and the Development of Individualized Learning Plan. And then the parallel curve is really adaptations of the Miller, the famous Miller pyramid, where we have to shift the nature of the assessments we're doing so that when we're getting closer to proficiency and launch for practice, that we really want to be emphasizing more of the work-based assessments. In other words, what can they do? Can they be entrusted for unsupervised practice? And that means we have to look at how they care for patients, how they interact with interprofessional team members, and so forth. And that's a big part of programmatic assessment, should be heavily weighted toward the work-based assessments. And I know you'll cover a lot of that in this wonderful week you're all experiencing. And I'm clearly having serious FOMO right now, the fear of missing out. But I'm sure that you'll discuss these issues as you move through. And as we think about co-production from the learner perspective, we have to bring co-production into the clinical learning environment, right? And so where learners are now one of the key stakeholders interacting with patients and the provider and other care teams, really as partners in co-production, feeding and forward and feeding back data constantly help us get better as we improve. And so this is an adaptation, again, taken from Eugene Nelson about what a co-production system looks like in an educational environment. And so here's just some closing thoughts, and I'm happy to take some questions. I think we have to recognize both the quality of healthcare and medical education teaching institutions is highly interdependent. You cannot separate one from the other. The amount of variation in educational outcomes is not defensible from a patient community perspective. It just isn't. And finally, co-production provides one approach to simultaneously improve both healthcare and medical education. It's not the approach. Is one of the things we've learned in CBME, it takes a combination, it's an amalgam of many things we need to do. But I do think co-production as both an approach and philosophy holds tremendous potential to really help us accelerate the adoption of a competency-based model. And with that, I will stop sharing, and thank you so much for allowing me to join you virtually.
Wow, thank you, Eric. It's so wonderful to hear your thought and to be inspired by you again. Okay, as far as I know, it's 9:30 in Chicago, is that right? And it's cold, right?
I am actually on the East Coast, so it is 10:50 here on the East Coast.
Okay, but you're sleeping. Okay.
Not yet.
Okay, now we'd like to open your questions, open to the audience for questions. So any questions for Eric in Chicago? Oh, Eric, actually, when I look at your EVA story and those let me check your word. The program rating behavior problem. Well, I think the co-production is very, very important, and especially you have to shift the traditional pyramid to this co-production circle. But what I'm thinking is the key factor which make this co-production successful might be the faculties, right? Because I don't know whether my observation is right, but when we implement CBME in Taiwan in the past few years, at first our staff they are trained, they are taught to do something, to do rating, to do program design, but after years they will come up with their problem. They say, okay, if you want me to rate the trainer and to provide him good enough feedback to guide him to be a competent professionals, I need to redesign my program to make sure that I can teach them what we think we should teach, and to assess them what we should assess. That means the faculties, they are growing. They're growing with us, with the system. And without them, I think we are not able to teach and to assess and to provide feedback and to perform qualified co-production. So through all your speech, what I'm thinking is the faculty development is so important. I don't know what's your opinion.
Yeah, I think faculty development is important. A lot of these are new skills none of us were taught when we were in training. I certainly wasn't. And I think faculty also have to learn how to be receptor sites for learners. We've been taught, or socialized into thinking we have to be the sage on the stage or the expert instead of being a partner, where we oftentimes may need to learn together. I know Jason's in the room there. Hello, Jason. And one of Jason's colleagues, Brian Wong, has talked a lot about the concept of co-learning around abilities that both learners and faculty are trying to acquire. And Brian's done that particularly in the context of quality improvement and patient safety. So there's no question that faculty development is part of this. But as we think about faculty development, we might want to think about doing that in a co-produced model where we don't just separate the faculty, but they actually do it along with learners. So if we're going to actually co-produce assessment, where we want learners to seek out assessment and learn how to do that, seek out feedback, we should think about doing more faculty development kind of collaboratively, both learner and faculty. And that would be a form of co-learning to support co-production.
Hey, Eric. Hello.
Hey, hi.
I just want to refer back to the study that you mentioned about EVARs. And then if you're able to look at that, if there is an inflection point on that learning trajectory, that you could identify those that actually didn't perform so well in the early stage on their training program.
Yeah, I mean, I showed you data from a single time point. For the purpose of the study, we chose the milestone rating 6 months prior to graduation. The reason we did that was because we wanted to see if there was a signal where there at least would be an opportunity to intervene. But to your point, the earlier you can identify somebody, the better. And so in that particular situation, yeah, it actually holds up, Pedro, in earlier assessments. And you could see what those curves look like by program. I mean, it's kind of ironic that the programs that had the lowest mean rating, in other words, they gave the lowest mean milestone ratings for all of their graduates, were actually the most accurate. I mean, if they gave a really high rating, those residents did really well in practice, right? They did better than those coming out of those programs that were giving high ratings to their residents. So it's a really interesting situation, but the ultimate goal here is to figure out ways to use data and then look as far back into residency as possible so that you can maximize the time to intervene. And I think your point's really important. As you know, that's the whole concept behind the predictive probability values. Again, another wonderful tool that Kenji Yamazaki led the development, where you can look at the percent risk you're not going to reach the proficiency or level 4 threshold by the end of graduation. The nice thing for the vascular surgery, because they have such good clinical data to work with, is that they can use those PPVs now in their program, and they can see exactly where they're going to line up, right? Because they can look at the predictive value based on where they are, based on this end state, and now they'll have a pretty good sense of that person's probably a pretty high risk for a higher rate of major complications than EVAR. Now, the problem is we don't have, as you know, Pedro, great registry data for a lot of stuff. Jason actually did a podcast on a study done by Brian George. It was a really nice study, methodologically very sound. But unfortunately, the quality of the claims data was actually quite limited. They had to aggregate multiple complications that don't really hold together well. And they had a limited number of cases per surgeons, which was kind of stunning. In this case, we had a lot of procedures for these surgeons with great clinical data. So in the Brian George study, it's a combination of probably not having great outcomes data to use, and I have little doubt there's also challenges with the surgical milestones. I don't think they were designed as well as vascular surgery, so it's a both and. We've had another study using registry data where we did see, as you know, Pedro, a relationship between patient complaints and a special registry called PARS and milestone ratings. And so the two studies where we've looked at registry data, you know, the associations are pretty strong. And again, I think it's partly because that data is pretty rich, right? You just have better granular detail. There is a 4-study just submitted that used machine learning model out of David Ash's colleague shop, Rachel Keltz, looking at surgical complications and milestone ratings. And in their study, using data pulled again from 2 states, so again, better data, they found a relationship between mortality and milestone ratings. And they also, again, guess what, saw a program level effect. So we're now seeing multiple studies of institutional program level effects as well as individual level performance. Again, it's those interactions, those interdependencies that we know are so important.
Great. Yes, the last question, because the time is limited.
Yeah, sorry about that.
We'd like to have you here. You got
I know.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, okay. They told me that the time is really over. Okay, so so next time, please be with us. And by the way, don't forget to give another speech tomorrow morning, tomorrow evening, okay, in Kesey's group. Okay, thank you. Thank you, Eric. Have a good sleep. Sleep tight.
Bye.
Great, lovely. So now we move to the other section.
好，谢谢 Dr. Eric 给我们精彩的演讲。那大家意犹未尽没有关系哈，那我们以后还是可以跟他好好的联络哈。好，接下来恭请台湾急诊医学会许建清理事长以及中国附医邱德发副院长上台主持这个演讲，主题是释放学习者潜能，在教与学中的共创。
许建清教授是奇美医院急诊部的部长，以及台湾急诊医学会的理事长。那对我们超音波以及医学教育全力的支持。那邱德发教授是本院教学部的主任以及教学副院长。那所拥有的这个教学热情，也是公认我们所有的这个医学教育工作者的榜样。那我们欢迎2位座长，掌声欢迎。
Dear distinguished speakers and all participants, I'm Qian Qunshi from Taiwan Society of Emergency Medicine. I'm honored to chair this session. The Taiwan Society of Emergency Medicine has been promoting CBME for over a decade. Through our collective efforts in medical education, CBME has become a familiar term for emergency physicians and residents in Taiwan, and also has become part of our daily education. Moving forward, we have to continue to foster a culture of teaching and learning. Let me introduce the next speaker, Dr. Raghdah Al-Bualy. She is Acting Director of the Graduate Medical Education Department and Head of Assessment and Performance Section at the Oman Medical Specialty Board, OMSB. She is responsible for monitoring and assessment process and developing tools for residency and fellowship training programs at OMSB. She also oversees accreditation by ACGME International. She holds a Master of Science in Health Professional Education and a Master of Healthcare Administration from Maastricht University, the Netherlands. Dr. Raghdah has worked at the Education Institute at Cleveland Clinic. She's also a certified Hogan assessor. Dr. Raghdah is involved in training physician faculty and leaders. Her research interests include assessment, design and implementation, faculty development, and co-creation of education. Today, Dr. Raghdah will discuss unlocking learner potential, the power of co-creation in teaching and learning. Let's welcome Dr. Raghdah.
Thank you very much. I'm very grateful and honored to be here and speaking to you about learner potentials and unlocking learner potentials in co-creation. So I'll start with a story. In 2021, Dr. A resident at OMSB, had this to say. So at the beginning, I was hesitant and I wanted to say no, because as I told you, I'm a bit of an introvert and I don't usually give my opinions or I don't attend meetings or talk about these things. Fast forward to 2023, and this is what she had to say. It added to me the confidence to participate in projects and to participate in other conferences as well. The confidence to give my opinion and share it with others that are even more senior than us. So what happened with Dr. A? Dr. A was involved in a co-creation project, which I'll talk about later. But before we get into that, I'll touch upon these points. So what is co-creation, the impact of it, the potential challenges, and some tips for you to carry it forward. So co-creation is defined as a close collaboration between students and teachers that aims to improve teaching and learning by welcoming students' perspectives and actively involving them in the educational design process and management of education. As you can see from this, from the Web of Science, in the past couple of years, the interest in involving learners in co-creation has increased, and almost we have over 6,000 articles in the past 2 or 3 years that looks into the involvement of learners in co-creation by students. Thinking about the levels of co-creation, there is this concept of a ladder of participation, and involvement of learners in co-creating varies from the bottom of the ladder, where usually teachers are more in control in the decision-making process. And as we go up the ladder, students have more say in the decision-making process of their teaching as well as learning processes. So if you take a moment, just reflect on your own context. Where do you fall in this ladder? How high or how low are you in this ladder? And where would you like to be moving forward, involving your students and learners in the process? When we talk about co-creation, these are different terminologies that we hear and read about in the literature. So co-creation, the student voice, participatory design, co-design, empowerment, student-staff partnerships, all of these terms allude to more or less the same concept with some variations. And we see all of these used interchangeably in the literature regarding co-creation or participatory design. Just to disentangle that a little bit more, when we talk about co-creation, it's more on the top where students and learners are looked at as design partners. So there is a partnership between them and their teachers where they can negotiate their curriculum. If we go down there where students are more users of learning, then the curriculum is usually dictated to them. The participation is claimed, but really it's the teachers and the tutors who are more in control. So these are some of the differences. The effects of co-creation come threefold and can also extend. So when we talk about co-creation, we think about these three areas. For the learners, there's better learning. For teachers, better teaching. And then we can't forget all the other stakeholders who are also involved in this whole process. The people within this triangle are usually the ones who are involved in the co-creation projects, but then usually the effects of co-creation extend to everyone else beyond those involved in a project as well. So all other students, all other learners, and teachers as well. So these are some of the effects that we need to keep in mind when we look at the involvement of stakeholders in co-creation. So what are the impacts of co-creation? The impact is on three levels: the psychosocial learning environment, the motivation and metacognition, and finally the quality of education. With a psychosocial learning environment, we look at a more positive, inclusive, and democratic learning environment if we involve all of our students and learners in the process. Motivation and metacognition at a personal level, it increases the sense of ownership, responsibility, and reflection, so more into the self-determination theory thoughts of a learner or an individual who is involved in such projects. And finally, the quality of education also can get affected if you involve different voices in this process. If we go back to Dr. A, for example, these are some of the things that she had said. So I think the collaboration or relationship now is better between me and other trainers. She also said that when I saw the trainers and how they think and how they try to find appropriate words, I'm more motivated to share my opinion because I know it makes a difference. And then the quality of education, after they got involved in this project, they felt that the evaluations reflect their program and follows exactly what we're doing in our daily practice. So what happened with her? Collaboration. She collaborated with other learners, collaborated with other faculty, as well as key individuals. And collaboration is basically the key and the best approach to listening to learners. But that doesn't come without challenges. Definitely, as much as we would like to do this, it is quite challenging, and I'll just highlight some of the things here. The challenges are also looked at from three perspectives: the learner perspective, the teacher-faculty perspective, and the institutions. From the learners, threefold: insecurity or lack of process and content expertise. So sometimes learners are unaware of and unsure of this process. They don't know where to start, they don't know how much they need to share, and so on. Voice fatigue. Learners have concerns that their voices, even if they speak up, they might not be heard. And so this ends up getting them not sharing so much. And then also the idea of hierarchy and power relationships. So these are some of the examples that some of our learners had also shared with us after being involved in some co-creation projects within these three areas. Teachers are afraid of giving up control sometimes. Skepticism of the process. Will it work? Will they really add so much to this whole process? They are not learned, they're not educators, so how much can they share with us? Perceived threats of giving up control as well, and different ways of communication. So these are some of the areas that teachers have highlighted in relation to being involved in a co-creation, co-design project. And then also feelings of insecurity. So being unaware of the process, being unaware of how much they can share within different areas. And finally, from the institutional point of view, the lack of support, which is extremely important, the lack of recognition, the lack of policy or vision for the organization on how is it that we want to involve our students, at what levels and how much, and the lack of experience. So all of these areas lead to institutions being a bit skeptical or not really involving these or actually doing these co-creation projects within the institutions. Again, I bring this point up. Collaboration really helps with this whole process, and just having all of these people or individuals and stakeholders in the process can help. So an approach to co-creation is to try to create a safe and inviting environment, decreasing this power difference between the teachers and the learners, developing shared responsibilities between all, and developing this confidence in co-creation with learners. As we do this, we need to be aware of the concept of pseudo-partnerships. And what are pseudo-partnerships? Basically, it's a balance between no partnership and true partnership, where no partnership is a failure to involve any student and include their voices in the curriculum design or assessment design, and moving into true partnership where there's maximum involvement of students in the educational process. What does pseudo-partnership look like from the faculty point of view? You might hear these from some faculty. We send them the surveys to capture their opinions, or we call them to co-create, but they're silent, or we call them to co-create, but their opinions are worthless. These are things that are real and have been heard from actual faculty members. And these are thoughts that we actually involve them, but in reality, there's a pseudo-partnership, there's this fake partnership that is taking place. So how do we go about that? Some practical experiences. You might ask, when is the best time to involve learners in a co-creation project? And this is a study by Al-Bualy and just in press right now. So the co-creation discussions before and after a course make a difference. When you do a co-creation project and try to involve learners or teacher voices before taking a course, a specific course, the learners end up giving you opinions that are more innovative rather than those who have involved in a co-creation project after taking a course. In that case, they are more looking at the course for feedback and evaluation, so more of an improvement point of view. And so trying to think about these differences and when would be the best time to involve your learners is crucial, depending on your context, depending on what it is that you're trying to co-create. So choosing the moment deliberately is important. Don't be afraid of actually involving learner voices, whether it is before, during, or after, or all three points of time if necessary. And combining these different moments of co-creation can be helpful, again, really depending on your context. What we need to do is maybe start with orientation workshops. These are some tips that you can start with. This helps ensuring the psychological safety of learners as well as teachers. So an introduction to co-creation, what is it, what is the process, what is it going to involve, and so on. These are really important for learners as well as teachers to understand the process. Remember, one of the challenges was the lack of understanding of the process, and these workshops actually help. Having a moderator or facilitator role in ensuring the psychological safe environment is also quite important and helpful in your process as a co-creator. So the moderator role should be there to help invite people, foster this respect, and resolve any conflict if it happens within your project or the process. I'll give an example of an anatomical pathology assessment system. This is where Dr. A came from. The goals of this project was to redesign the workplace-based assessment system and make it a bit more fit for purpose. The program wanted to make their assessment system more program-specific in terms of content as well as internal structure. They also wanted to look at faculty development and how the response process of the faculty to this workplace-based assessment system. The secondary goal, as Fremen earlier spoke about, how assessment and curriculum are really interdependent. So we started by looking at workplace-based assessments, and that was their primary goal. But what ended up happening is that they had to go back and redesign their curriculum as well to match what they're trying to do within their assessment. So that was another thing that they achieved. So what we did is we did a change laboratory cycle of looking at the workplace-based assessments. They looked at existing systems. They unveiled some challenges within their workplace-based assessment, including faculty development and curriculum and implementation, actually. They reconceptualized their assessments. So through these change laboratory sessions, both virtually as well as in person. And finally, they implemented a new redesigned workplace-based assessment after a pilot and then a full implementation. We had around 11 group sessions in about 27 hours of meetings. They started with looking at 3 forms, and then they ended up producing 8 forms because they thought they need to be more rotation specific. What ended up happening is that the forms became a lot shorter than what they used to be, and very targeted to what it is that they're doing in their daily practice. It was a group of 9 participants, including faculty, residents, as well as the program administrator. And we also had some 3 individual sessions in between just to re-review what was happening in between the sessions. So just to finalize this, some tips if you're looking into co-creation, break it down into phases, pre, during, and post. There are different ways of involving your learners at different points in time. Preparation is key. The orientation sessions are really helpful and really help with the process. Once people understand what's happening, then their creativity actually increases as well. And ask for help, like have facilitators, moderators, even from outside your programs. They can be very helpful in facilitating this process. So to unlock learner potential, engage them in your educational design projects. They bring unique perspectives. They have some surprising solutions and really can help transform your perceptions. Thank you for listening.
Because the time is limited, so we just have one question. Is there any question from the audience? Yeah, Freeman.
Just based on, thank you so much, Raghdah. It's an amazing talk and inspiring. I believe the learners' participation and especially into the design of education delivery is the critical point. My question is that, how do you think when we try to assess the implementation fidelity for CBME, how do you think about to apply co-creation to improve the implementation fidelity, or doing some implementation research?
I think involving both the learners and the teachers in the implementation fidelity research will be very helpful. As I said, if you include learners before or after the co-creation project, they give you different perspectives. And maybe with implementation fidelity, something that can be thought about is even looking into learners before they come into the programs. So potential learners who are about to become residents, they might have some additional ideas in addition to the actual current learners in the process. So that's something that can be useful and thought about as an idea.
Okay. This is the end of this section. The program of this afternoon will be start at 1:20. Yeah. Thank you for your participation.
好，谢谢 Dr. Raghdah 哈。接下来是午餐时间哈，我们也为各位准备了美味的午餐。那各位贵宾的用餐地点以及下午工作坊的地点就在您的识别证的背面。